Under the relentless sun, the Gobi Desert stretches in a panorama of jagged cliffs, shifting dunes and hidden valleys, where fossilized eggs lie quietly in the sand and stone circles mark places whose purpose has been lost to time. Ghostly lights flicker over remote ridges, and unmarked cairns hint at human activity that science cannot fully explain. Step into the hidden chambers and trace the faint trails of vanished caravans, moving across dunes where subtle shifts and buried ruins defy understanding. From the flaming cliffs' fossilized giants to the silent whispers of the desert itself, each discovery challenges comprehension, blending history, science, and the inexplicable, leaving every footprint in the sand threaded with questions that refuse to be answered. The abandoned walls of Karakoto. The desert horizon stretches in a muted haze where sand meets sky, and the remnants of past civilizations lie scattered beneath shifting dunes that have erased countless stories, yet one place stands apart for the unease it inspires even among seasoned explorers. The ruins of Karakoto rise from this desolation as battered walls and fractured towers, their silhouettes casting long shadows that darken the surrounding plain. Knowledge of its existence has passed from historian to traveller in fragments, but the mystery surrounding the city's abrupt abandonment remains one of the Gobi Desert's most enduring puzzles. Scholars have gathered manuscripts, archaeological reports, and eyewitness accounts, yet each source seems to leave more questions than answers. Standing among the wind-scoured stones, it becomes difficult to imagine how a city of such strategic importance could vanish from the historical record without leaving a clear explanation behind. A distant view of Karakoto gives the impression of a fortress anchored into the earth, but closer inspection reveals a settlement carefully arranged behind thick defensive walls made of tamped earth, the material still holding its shape after centuries of exposure. The Tangut people of the Western Xia dynasty built the city in the 11th century, establishing it as a vital trading post along the caravan routes that connected Central Asia with northern China. Archaeological surveys confirm that its walls once enclosed temples, administrative buildings, storage compounds, and residential quarters, all positioned near a river that has since altered its course. Written sources indicate a flourishing community that controlled trade and tax routes for generations, yet the city's last decades are recorded only in fragments that fail to explain why its population abandoned it so suddenly. What remains today is a shell of its former self, a place where silence settles heavily over an absence that cannot be easily defined. The first outsiders to document the ruins in detail were members of early 20th century expeditions, among them the Russian explorer Pyotr Kozlov, whose findings brought Karakoto into academic discussion. Kozlov recovered thousands of manuscripts and printed texts that showed the cultural and linguistic richness preserved within the city before its decline. Many of these documents were stored in small rooms along the interior walls, their arrangement suggesting a form of community archive or monastic library. The materials he retrieved established Karakoto as one of the most important sources of Tangut literature, yet they also revealed signs of hurried concealment. Manuscripts had been bundled into fabric wrappings and placed behind sealed partitions, and several rooms showed indications that occupants attempted to hide important texts before leaving. Archaeologists have since debated whether these actions indicate fear, preparation for siege, or ritual closure, but no single explanation has gained consensus. Excavations around the city's perimeter show that its outer defences were built to withstand prolonged attacks, and historical records note Mongol military campaigns that reached the region during the early 13th century. While some scholars suggest that the city fell during these incursions, the visible ruins tell a more complicated story. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass graves from pitched battles, and no evidence of catastrophic destruction common in sites that endured direct assault. Instead, the city appears to have been abandoned in stages, with household items left in situ and construction projects halted mid-process. Soil layers indicate gradual encroachment by desert sands rather than sudden devastation, which suggests a departure orchestrated not by force, but by internal decisions or environmental pressures not fully understood. Even the city's primary water source, the Heihe River, presents ambiguities in its historical behaviour, with shifting channels that may have altered the viability of settlement, but not in a time frame that matches the abrupt disappearance suggested by surviving accounts. A closer look at the manuscripts reveals spiritual concerns woven throughout daily life, with references to protective rituals and invocations preserved among economic records, legal documents, and religious texts. These writings often reference threats from both natural and human forces, yet none specify a reason for the city's final evacuation. Of particular note are texts that mention the repeated need to guard against encircling dangers, a phrase whose meaning remains difficult to translate with precision. Linguists examining Tangut terminology have offered interpretations ranging from military encroachment to environmental upheaval, but the ambiguity leaves room for speculation. The fact that these expressions occur near the city's final decades deepens the sense that something unsettled its inhabitants enough to catalogue concern, yet not describe the cause explicitly. The physical layout of Karakoto adds further complexity to its enigmatic end. Buildings along the inner wall appear to have been used for administrative meetings, and their floors show little evidence of struggle or forced entry. Rooms that once housed pottery, textiles, and tools feature scattered remnants, but not in patterns associated with rapid invasion or extensive looting. Instead, objects seem to have been set aside, left as if the occupants expected to return. This impression is reinforced by the presence of intact storage jars containing grain residues, offering a glimpse into a settlement that did not appear on the brink of famine or economic collapse. Such findings complicate theories that the population fled due to scarcity or conflict, creating a portrait of a city that remained viable until the moment it emptied itself of people. Environmental studies provide an additional layer of uncertainty. The surrounding region is dominated by arid plains and shifting sands, and the city's proximity to the desert makes dune movement an ongoing threat. Historical climatology suggests periods of increased aridity during the early second millennium, yet these shifts alone do not account for the precise timing of Karakoto's abandonment. The gradual rise of dunes around the city's eastern walls indicates that encroachment postdated the settlement's decline, not caused it. Moreover, layers of sediment inside the city suggest that wind-driven sands accumulated only after the structures were left unattended, implying that environmental pressures worsened following the departure of its residents rather than prompting it. Stories passed through local communities long after the city fell into ruin mention a place struck by misfortune, though such stories often blend memory with folklore. These accounts emphasize the city's isolation and the fear it generated among those who travelled near its walls, yet none provide verifiable details about its final days. Some travellers noted the unsettling stillness that clings to its faded corridors, while others remarked on the way sound behaves unpredictably within the broken structures. Acoustic surveys show that the narrow lanes between walls can trap wind in ways that produce low, resonant tones, which may have contributed to the legends surrounding the site. These natural explanations, however, do little to resolve the deeper questions raised by the city's unexplained disappearance. Modern archaeological methods have allowed scholars to map hidden features beneath the surface, revealing partially collapsed storage rooms and subsurface foundations that suggest a once complex urban design. Yet even these discoveries have failed to clarify the central question of why the population left so quickly and completely. The absence of human remains within the city boundaries is notable, as many abandoned settlements preserve at least partial evidence of those who stayed behind. Instead, Karakoto presents only empty rooms, broken walls, and scattered artifacts that speak to a life interrupted but not violently extinguished. This silence, carved into each surviving structure, weighs heavily upon researchers who attempt to reconstruct the city's final chapter. Every excavation season uncovers new fragments that build upon existing knowledge, yet refuse to form a complete narrative, ensuring that Karakoto remains as elusive today as it was when first rediscovered. The city's walls still stand as if waiting for an explanation that continues to slip through the grasp of those who seek it. And somewhere within those shadows, the unanswered reason for Karakoto's abandonment still lies hidden in the silence that no one has yet been able to interpret. The buried chambers beneath Kamar Monastery. Across the quiet rise of the southeastern Gobi, Kamar Monastery stands against the pale landscape with an air of deliberate stillness that draws attention to what lies hidden beneath it. Low buildings shaped by centuries of devotion rest on ground that has shifted and settled through countless seasons, their red and white walls contrasting against the muted sands that surround them. pilgrims and travellers have long approached the monastery for its historical and spiritual significance, rarely suspecting that a deeper mystery lies buried out of sight. The story of the chambers said to exist beneath these structures emerges gradually in historical notes and oral recollections, threading through the monastery's past like an unresolved question that refuses to disappear. Even in a region shaped by erosion and constant wind, this particular uncertainty stands apart for the way it eludes both historical clarity and scientific explanation. Early written notes from 19th century travellers mention the unexpected discovery of underground rooms near the monastery's foundations, setting in motion a puzzle that has never been fully resolved. These accounts describe simple excavations, conducted during periods when the monastery underwent repairs or partial abandonment, revealing openings in the ground that led downward into spaces carved with more precision than natural cavities. Observers recorded smooth walls shaped from compacted earth, the faint outlines of niches, and what seemed to be remnants of structural supports embedded in the surrounding soil. Although their reports differed in tone and detail, they shared a sense of bewilderment at finding hidden architecture where no such construction had been expected. These initial descriptions remain some of the only first-hand testimonies of the chamber's appearance before shifting sands concealed them once more. Inside those first documented openings, the explorers described dim corridors where compacted soil pressed in from every direction and where only fragments of carved beams hinted at deliberate construction. The air was said to be cool and dry, with surfaces bearing marks that suggested the rooms had once been used regularly, perhaps for storage or ritual purposes. No inscriptions were noted, and no artifacts were recovered to offer clear chronological markers, leaving researchers uncertain about who built the chambers or why they had been sealed. The few sketches that survive from these early encounters depict narrow passageways leading into broader spaces, though the artists often acknowledged that collapsing sediment prevented them from capturing the full layout. These fragments of documentation now serve as a rare window into what existed before subsequent collapses removed access entirely. Beneath the monastery's surface, shifting strata and the gradual settling of ancient dune layers create unstable conditions that complicate any attempt to understand how deep the chambers once extended. Geologists studying the Gobi's subsurface layers note that the region's soils contain alternating bands of sand, clay, and compacted silt, each responding differently to moisture and wind erosion. Over time, such layers can buckle, sink, or compress without leaving obvious surface signatures, a process that might explain why the chamber's entrances shifted or vanished soon after their initial discovery. The weight of the monastery's structures above them may have accelerated these changes, especially during periods of disrepair when maintenance was limited and foundations became uneven. These natural dynamics create a setting in which underground rooms could easily be lost even without human intervention. Accounts preserved within the monastic community add another dimension to the mystery, for they recall sealed spaces used for purposes long forgotten by the generations who now keep the monastery active. These recollections seldom rely on exact dates or detailed descriptions, instead referring to areas beneath the main buildings that were said to hold supplies, ceremonial items, or materials the community wished to protect. Monastic teachings typically emphasize the importance of maintaining specific ritual objects, and some oral histories suggest that earlier residents used underground rooms to shield such items from looting or destruction during troubled periods. While these statements provide cultural insight, they remain too vague to determine whether the described rooms correspond to the chambers recorded by 19th century observers. The overlap between myth and memory complicates efforts to interpret these accounts with confidence. Over time, the entrances that once allowed brief access into the subsurface areas began to collapse under the combined pressure of wind-blown sediment and weakening architectural supports. The corridors described by early explorers were reportedly unstable even at the time of their discovery, with walls crumbling at the slightest disturbance and ceilings shedding small amounts of compacted earth. Seasonal storms would have accelerated this process, driving sand into crevices and sealing narrow openings until they disappeared entirely. By the time later visitors attempted to locate the same points, they found that the terrain had changed enough to render earlier descriptions almost unusable. The monastery grounds shifted subtly with each passing year, leaving no clear indication of where the chambers had once been accessed. Maps drawn during the earliest investigations reveal a network of passages that no longer aligns with the present-day terrain, sparking debates over whether the ground shifted or the early sketches were incomplete. Some diagrams depict an L-shaped layout beneath the monastery's southern edge, while others show a more centralised cluster of rooms positioned below the main assembly hall. Differences in scale, angle and orientation make it difficult to determine which representation, if any, reflects the actual configuration. Scholars who have studied these documents suggest that the explorers may have relied on partial visibility and unstable lighting, causing them to misjudge distances or overlook secondary passages blocked at the time. These inconsistencies feed into the larger uncertainty surrounding the chamber's true form, leaving researchers without a reliable blueprint to guide further investigation. Modern surveys have attempted to relocate the lost chambers through ground-penetrating techniques, yet each effort has produced ambiguous signals that disappear before they can be confidently interpreted. Instruments detect subtle changes in density beneath the soil, but the region's layered composition often generates misleading readings that could signify natural voids rather than human-made rooms. Attempts to confirm such anomalies by limited probing have yielded mixed results, with some tests revealing compacted earth where hollow spaces were expected, and others finding unstable pockets too dangerous to excavate. These challenges underline the difficulty of working in a terrain that constantly shifts under the influence of seasonal winds and sediment movement, making any conclusions tentative at best. Seasonal movement of sand and the slow erosion of supporting rock layers continue to reshape the area around the monastery, burying clues almost as quickly as researchers attempt to uncover them. The Gobi's climate drives ceaseless patterns of displacement, ranging from gradual dune migration to sudden surface alterations following windstorms. Such forces can erase subtle depressions or seams that once marked the edges of underground features, leaving the landscape smooth and unbroken. The monastery's caretakers occasionally observe small changes in ground level after severe weather, noting slight dips or mounds that soon level out again. These shifts highlight the ongoing transformation occurring beneath the surface and the difficulty of identifying stable points from which to launch deeper investigation. Today, the mystery survives in the tension between the recorded existence of subterranean rooms and the stubborn refusal of the landscape to reveal where they once lay. Scholars rely on fragmented notes, inconsistent maps, and vague recollections to reconstruct a structure that may now be inaccessible or entirely collapsed. The absence of conclusive evidence does not diminish interest in the chambers. Rather, it reinforces the sense that something important slipped from view just before modern documentation became possible. As long as the soil continues to shift and the monastery stands above it, the question of what lies beneath remains suspended between memory and geology. Far below the unsettled earth, something obscured by depth and time continues to hold its silence in a way no survey has been able to disturb. The vanishing riverbed at Yolinam. Morning light falls across the narrow gorge of Yolinam, casting sharp shadows on its ice-lined cliffs as the wind whispers over the rock, hinting at the unusual behaviour of the river that threads through its base. The gorge, a striking cleft carved into the southern Gobi by millennia of erosion, presents an almost surreal contrast. Towering cliffs framing a narrow passage, with snow and ice clinging to shaded crevices even as the desert sun warms the open plains. Travellers approaching the gorge often find themselves drawn to the river, yet they are immediately confronted by the sense that its flow does not behave according to familiar expectations. In some areas, shallow water runs with measured consistency. In others, the riverbed stretches dry and cracked, as if the stream itself has vanished, leaving behind only traces of sediment and damp patches that hint at what once coursed there. Observing the scene in its entirety, it is impossible not to sense that the river's behaviour defies simple explanation, offering a mystery that has intrigued explorers for generations. During the spring melt, water flows in patches along the gorge floor, only to vanish inexplicably in stretches where no obvious channel disappears beneath the sand or stone. Pools collect in depressions where the rock formation dips slightly, their surfaces reflecting the jagged cliffs overhead, but downstream the bed often runs entirely dry. Geologists examining the area note that the natural gradient should produce a continuous flow from the melting snowfields above, yet repeated observation shows that the water seems to disappear into hidden fissures or sinkholes, only to re-emerge further along the course. The phenomenon is neither uniform nor predictable. One year, a previously dry stretch may hold water for weeks, while another experiences complete desiccation in a matter of days. The visual effect is disorienting, leaving observers to question whether the river truly ceases to exist in certain stretches or merely shifts to a hidden subterranean path. Travellers and surveyors from the early 20th century recorded the river's erratic presence, noting with surprise the sudden absence of running water in locations previously mapped as constant streams. Russian and Mongolian explorers described conditions in journals and field notes, documenting areas where water seemed to vanish without any observable cause. One account describes a group of surveyors who followed a pool for nearly a kilometre only to find the riverbed completely dry, though it had been full on previous expeditions. These first-hand observations established a pattern that has endured in the scientific literature. Yolinam's river behaves inconsistently, defying hydrological predictions and resisting definitive documentation. While some early explanations attributed the behaviour to seasonal drought, the records show that disappearance occurred even during periods of ample snowmelt, suggesting that an additional mechanism must be at work. Steep walls of sedimentary rock rise sharply on either side, their fractured layers guiding meltwater along unpredictable paths and forming pools whose formation defies simple topographical explanation. The gorge itself is a natural laboratory in miniature, where the interaction of ice, snowmelt and porous rock creates conditions that are unique even within the arid Gobi. Analysts examining cross-sections of the bedrock note fractures and fissures that allow water to seep underground, re-emerging unpredictably in lower sections of the canyon. Some channels appear to be completely blocked by sediment, only to suddenly reconnect with the river farther downstream. These observations complicate any attempt to model the river's behaviour, and they underscore that geological features alone cannot fully explain why the riverbed appears empty in stretches where it should be flowing. Measurements of snowmelt, seasonal runoff, and glacial input show inconsistencies that suggest the river's disappearance cannot be attributed solely to variations in volume or temperature. Hydrologists note that the rate of melting varies by altitude and aspect, and that wind patterns influence the accumulation of snow in hidden pockets. Even after accounting for these factors, however, discrepancies remain. Some sections of the river vanish entirely despite adequate input from upstream sources, while others maintain a slow, steady flow, regardless of local conditions. These irregularities challenge conventional understanding of ephemeral rivers and highlight the complexity of the interactions between topography, climate, and subterranean channels in the area. Recent surveys have deployed flow meters, GPS mapping, and subsurface probes, yet even with modern technology, the river seems to evade definitive observation, its course appearing and vanishing almost at will. Field teams report that instruments sometimes record water in one location, only for it to disappear hours later, while nearby dry channels suddenly reveal a return of flow. Attempts to trace underground seepage using dye tests have yielded partial success, but the results are inconsistent, suggesting a network of fissures and hidden reservoirs that remains largely unmapped. Even the most sophisticated equipment has failed to provide a full picture, leaving the river's vanishing behaviour an open question for geologists and hydrologists alike. Guides and herders describe moments when water surfaces in familiar stretches only to retreat without warning, sometimes returning days later along entirely different channels, a pattern observed for generations. Local knowledge, meticulously recorded in interviews and travelogues, emphasises that the river's unpredictability is not a modern phenomenon. Nomads recount that the same stretch of river could be full one season and entirely dry the next, forcing adjustments in grazing practices and water collection. These empirical observations, while anecdotal in form, corroborate the scientific record, offering a human perspective on a phenomenon that is otherwise defined by numbers and maps. The combination of first-hand observation and documented measurement underscores the reality of Yolinam's enigmatic hydrology. Evaporation, underground seepage, and porous alluvial deposits have all been suggested as explanations, yet none fully account for the rapidity and selectivity of the river's disappearance. Studies measuring soil permeability and subsurface channels suggest that water could be absorbed or diverted underground, but the volumes involved seem insufficient to explain the total disappearance over long stretches. Similarly, while evaporation is significant in the Gobi's arid climate, it cannot account for sudden changes in flow over short distances. Researchers remain divided, acknowledging that each factor plays a role, but that the combination does not fully reproduce the patterns observed over the past century. The river continues to confound conventional hydrological models, revealing how little is truly known about even well-documented natural systems in remote environments. Even with accumulated data from decades of observation, the precise mechanisms controlling the river's ephemeral presence remain unverified, leaving scientists and explorers alike in a state of continued uncertainty. Attempts to simulate its flow using modern software, historical snowpack data, and satellite imagery have produced models that occasionally approximate the river's behaviour, yet they consistently fail to predict the precise timing and location of disappearances. The resulting tension between expectation and observation reinforces the sense of mystery, creating a phenomenon that is both scientifically interesting and inherently elusive. For anyone who has followed the river's course over the years, it remains a symbol of the desert's hidden complexity, a reminder that nature sometimes resists categorization, even in the most systematic studies. And as the gorge stretches into the horizon, its riverbed disappears and reappears without warning, keeping the secret of its hidden course locked beneath the shifting ice and stone. The shifting dunes of Congaree-Nels. Each gust sweeps loose sand across Congaree-Nels, sculpting new ridges and hollows with every passing hour, a constant reminder that the desert is never truly still. Those who navigate the dunes, from nomadic herders to visiting explorers, quickly realize that the ground beneath them is as changeable as the wind itself. The dunes are not merely obstacles, they're active participants in shaping the desert, moving silently, concealing pathways and footprints in patterns that seem deliberate. Observers often note that ridges advance or retreat without warning, sometimes swallowing small depressions or flattening peaks that had been prominent for years. Even the sun, as it arcs over the horizon, cannot fix the contours of sand for more than a few fleeting moments, and shadows stretch and shrink across forms that will be gone by the following day. Within this ceaseless motion, it becomes apparent that Congaree-Nels is less a static landscape than a living entity, one whose processes are both mesmerizing and confounding. Expedition records and field journals describe sections of the desert swallowed by advancing dunes within months, erasing trails, markers, and even small encampments once thought permanent. Early 20th century travellers frequently remarked on how routes once deemed reliable could vanish almost entirely, forcing entire caravans to turn back or improvise new paths. Some accounts describe survey teams following a ridge for miles, only to return the following season to find it flattened or shifted beyond recognition. These observations are not anomalies. Repeated fieldwork over decades confirms that the desert's sand moves with both predictability in its general southward drift and capricious unpredictability in localized formations. Even when strong winds subside, the desert does not settle into stasis, hinting at forces that extend beyond mere surface gusts, and hinting at the subtle dynamics of subterranean structures and moisture variations influencing movement. Cartographic comparisons over decades reveal that Congaree-Nels does not merely creep forward, but reorganizes unpredictably, rendering older maps unreliable and highlighting the desert's dynamic nature. Lines once thought fixed dissolve under the march of dunes, with old survey markers buried or displaced. Early topographic maps indicate positions of dunes that are now entirely altered, their original heights, shapes, and alignments erased by the constant interplay of wind, gravity, and sand composition. Researchers analysing aerial photographs from different eras have traced a complex choreography of ridge collisions, splits, and migrations that shows patterns resembling natural rhythm rather than random chaos. Yet even with this visual record, the desert retains an air of mystery, as if it is actively resisting attempts at precise measurement and prediction, defying the very concept of permanence in landscape. Wind channels twist through narrow corridors between dune peaks, interacting with variations in sand composition to form ridges, hollows, and shifting patterns that defy straightforward modelling. The angles of slopes, particle size, and moisture content all contribute to how each ridge forms, migrates, or collapses, creating micro-landscapes that change daily. Some formations develop long, sharp crests that appear stable for weeks before suddenly folding or slipping down a slope. Others rise slowly in seemingly deliberate arrangements, masking depressions where wind and sand conspire to create temporary basins. Geologists attempting to quantify these movements find that localized conditions, such as hidden rock outcrops or subtle elevation changes, can drastically alter sand behavior, creating a complex system in which prediction is always provisional and certainty elusive. Buried shrubs, half-concealed animal tracks, and scattered remnants of human activity hint at a desert that consumes evidence of life almost as quickly as it appears. Traces of plants, sometimes only a few centimeters above the sand, vanish under a single storm, leaving no indication of prior vegetation. Wildlife tracks, small hoofprints or paw marks, are erased or redirected by shifting ridges, making the study of local fauna nearly impossible without constant observation. Archaeological artifacts, such as fragments of pottery or tools left by travellers centuries ago, are sometimes uncovered only to disappear again under successive layers of sand. These ephemeral discoveries illustrate how Congar acts as both preserver and obliterator, revealing fleeting secrets while simultaneously ensuring that most remain hidden indefinitely. Time-lapse photography and drone footage have captured dunes shifting imperceptibly over days and weeks, yet even these tools struggle to predict the course of individual ridges or anticipate sudden reconfigurations. Observers watch sand crawl across ridges and settle into hollows, only for unexpected collapses to occur elsewhere in the desert. Drone surveys allow for precise documentation of changes, showing the dunes advancing in measurable increments, yet even sophisticated mapping cannot account for the sudden accelerations caused by seasonal wind events or microclimatic variations. Researchers describe the dunes as having memory, retaining subtle patterns from previous shifts that influence subsequent movement, a phenomenon that remains only partially understood and resists simple explanation. Sudden storms and gusts can reshape entire slopes within hours, erasing carefully measured markers and forcing researchers to reconcile their observations with an ever-changing reality. Small depressions are filled in, long ridges fracture, and windswept troughs vanish in moments. The sheer unpredictability of these events makes fieldwork challenging and requires both adaptability and meticulous documentation. Even instruments designed to withstand sand abrasion can be rendered temporarily ineffective by the violent energy of a concentrated storm. For scientists attempting to map the desert or model its behavior, these dramatic alterations highlight the limits of technology and underscore the power of natural forces operating in ways that are difficult to anticipate. Herders who navigate the dunes describe moments when familiar ridges suddenly reveal hidden depressions or cover long-used pathways overnight, requiring travellers to navigate by instinct rather than maps. For centuries, local nomads have learned to read subtle cues, the way wind deposits sand along the edges of a ridge, the slight shifts in dune coloration, or the sounds produced by sand moving over itself. These observations are passed down through oral tradition and careful observation, forming an intimate knowledge of a landscape that is simultaneously familiar and unpredictable. Travellers without this understanding often find themselves disoriented, discovering that what appeared to be a safe corridor can become impassable in a single night, as sand shifts silently, erasing all evidence of prior passage. Despite decades of observation, historical records, and modern monitoring, the precise mechanisms behind the dunes' rapid shifts, selective coverage, and seeming purpose remain unexplained. Patterns emerge, only to dissolve again in ways that challenge conventional geomorphology. Some dunes migrate at rates measurable in meters per year, while others remain virtually stationary, forming islands of relative stability amid constant movement. The interplay between wind velocity, sand density, underlying terrain, and even subtle moisture differences creates a complexity that continues to frustrate researchers. Every new observation raises further questions, emphasizing that Congar is not merely a desert to be measured, but a system to be experienced, one whose behavior often surpasses human understanding. Invisible currents of wind continue their work, advancing and retreating the dunes of Congar while keeping the desert's deepest secrets buried beneath ever-shifting sand. The last camp at Tugrujian Shiray. A sudden stillness greeted the travellers as they approached Tugrujian Shiray, broken only by the faint clatter of a loose metal object and the distant murmur of wind through hollow structures. Signs of a recently abandoned camp became visible in scattered belongings and upturned containers, suggesting that its occupants had left in haste, leaving the place suspended between presence and absence. The absence of smoke from fires that should have been stoked, the way utensils lay askew, and the odd placement of saddlebags painted a scene of abrupt departure, hinting at unseen pressures that had driven inhabitants from what had once been a safe resting spot. Every detail, from footprints fading in irregular patterns to scattered fragments of clothing, seemed to suggest a story cut short, a routine interrupted by something that no observer could yet define. Fragments of cooking utensils, partially packed saddlebags, and stray journal pages hinted at a sudden departure, offering clues about daily life while deepening the mystery of why the camp had been forsaken so abruptly. A lone kettle lay inverted, dust filling its cavity, while a partially disassembled stove rested beside a mat that had once been neatly rolled. Small items of personal significance, a fragment of a notebook, a worn pair of gloves, were scattered as if the occupants had no time to collect them. Archaeologists and explorers who later documented these remnants noted that the pattern of abandonment did not suggest panic in the conventional sense, nor did it indicate a natural catastrophe like sudden flooding or sand collapse. The scene spoke instead of decisions made swiftly and perhaps under pressure, leaving only speculation behind. Earlier records from explorers and nomadic travellers described Togrujian Shirai as a temporary waypoint, used cautiously due to sudden weather shifts and unpredictable conditions that could force travellers to move with little warning. Maps from the early 20th century indicate the plateau as part of a network of intermittent stops for caravans and herding groups, chosen for its relative elevation and sparse shelter. Field notes described the site as both practical and precarious. It provided a temporary refuge from wind and exposure, yet its isolation meant that those who remained too long were at the mercy of changing conditions. These historical accounts emphasize a pattern of caution, illustrating that abandonment of the site was not uncommon, though rarely as complete or sudden as the evidence at the last camp suggests. Strong gusts and temperature swings can arrive without warning, making tents, fires, and equipment vulnerable to sudden upheaval, yet no signs of disaster were apparent, leaving observers puzzled. Rocks and debris remained largely undisturbed, and there were no visible signs of fire or flooding damage. Scholars studying the plateau consider that environmental triggers may have played a role, but the absence of obvious calamity complicates the narrative. Some speculate that rapid microclimatic shifts, localized vortex winds, or sudden sand movements could have contributed to the urgency with which the camp was vacated. The precision of what was left behind, paired with the suddenness of departure, suggests a careful but hurried response to a threat or pressing necessity. Nomadic travellers and expeditioners alike have noted that camps in this region were occasionally abandoned due to logistical necessity or the rapid movement of animals, but the speed and completeness of this exodus remained striking even to seasoned observers. Pack animals left tethered in irregular positions, food caches unopened, and water skins still partially filled indicate that those who departed did not intend a permanent abandonment. The logistical impossibility of packing up an entire camp in moments without leaving traces makes the evidence at Togrujian Shirai particularly perplexing. Scholars debate whether a sudden signal, environmental cue, or other unseen factor prompted the departure, yet no records offer a definitive explanation for the unusually meticulous yet rapid evacuation. Items left behind, a disassembled stove, a worn saddle, and fragments of personal belongings offered fleeting insights into the routines of the camp, yet none explained the abruptness with which it had been deserted. Small artifacts suggest daily patterns: cooking, rest, animal care, and record keeping. Each piece hints at life interrupted, as if the occupants had been forced to leave mid-task. Anthropologists and desert researchers find this type of abandonment particularly intriguing because it combines elements of normalcy with a sudden rupture, a frozen snapshot of ordinary existence disrupted by something unknown. The juxtaposition of mundane objects and the apparent urgency of departure emphasizes the unresolved tension at the heart of the mystery. Satellite imagery and recent surveys reveal faint impressions of the camp's layout amid shifting terrain, confirming the sudden disappearance of the occupants, while underscoring how ephemeral human presence can be in this isolated region. Modern technology captures depressions where tents once stood, faint trails left by animals, and subtle disturbances in the plateau's surface. Yet even high-resolution imaging cannot explain why the camp was abandoned, nor can it predict whether similar events occur in nearby areas with comparable frequency. Analysts note that, while the physical layout remains legible from above, the story of human behaviour, the decisions, the motivations, the pressures, is largely invisible, leaving an interpretive void filled only with hypotheses and conjecture. Locals tell of sudden noises, fleeting shadows and unexplained movements near Tugruji and Shirei, suggesting that the site has long been a place where ordinary observation cannot fully capture the events that unfold. Oral traditions describe sounds that arrive without wind, figures glimpsed only peripherally, and moments when animals seem unsettled without apparent cause. Such accounts, while anecdotal, reinforce the sense that the plateau carries an aura of unpredictability. For generations, those familiar with the region have approached the site with caution, and even modern researchers report a palpable sense of unease when investigating the plateau, lending the abandoned camp an almost intangible presence that persists long after human footsteps fade. Even with careful documentation and repeated field investigations, the reasons for the camp's abrupt abandonment remain unclear, with explanations ranging from environmental hazards to unseen forces, yet no single theory fully accounts for what occurred. Historical context, meteorological data, and field observations offer clues, but none provide a complete understanding. Patterns emerge only to dissipate under closer scrutiny, and hypotheses regarding wind anomalies, wildlife interactions, or urgent survival necessities are all plausible yet insufficient. This ambiguity has fueled continued curiosity among desert researchers, anthropologists, and explorers, each drawn to Tugruji and Shirei by the lingering enigma of a place where human activity seems to vanish almost as quickly as it occurs. Every object left behind, every imprint on the ground seems to whisper the story of a departure that may never be understood. The disappearance of the Omnogovi fossil cache. The clatter of rock tools echoed across the excavation site as researchers first uncovered the fossil fragments, their careful brushing revealing bones embedded with surprising clarity beneath the arid soil of Omnogovi. Each piece seemed to shimmer with the weight of ancient life, its surface etched with patterns of wear and preservation that had survived millennia of shifting sands and desiccation. The team paused frequently, marvelling at the unexpected abundance of skeletal remains, their excitement tempered by the awareness that even the smallest misstep could shatter millennia of preservation. The cache had been unearthed in a relatively small depression, hidden from plain view, yet its significance was immediately apparent to those trained in paleontological observation. Every fragment, from delicate vertebrae to robust limb bones, testified to a world long vanished, a puzzle now partially exposed yet still largely enigmatic. Each fossil spoke to an ancient world, fragments of species rarely preserved outside the Gobi, providing insights into prehistoric ecosystems that had long vanished from memory. Among the finds were remnants of herbivorous dinosaurs, their teeth and jaw fragments hinting at feeding behaviours and ecological niches that no modern animal could replicate. Small theropods were represented in scattered bones, suggesting a previously unknown concentration of predatory species in the region. Sediment analysis indicated a period of unusual stability in which these creatures had been buried, preserving the bones in almost pristine condition. The scientific implications were extraordinary. The cache could reshape understandings of species distribution, paleoecology, and the broader geological history of the desert, turning a remote site into a focal point of global research. The cache lay partially sheltered in a shallow depression, its orientation hinting at natural protection, while subtle sediment layers suggested a stability that had endured for millennia. The surrounding terrain showed traces of minor erosion, yet the fossils themselves were lodged in undisturbed strata, providing an unusually clear stratigraphic record. Researchers noted the compacted layers of silt and sand, each representing successive seasons and climatic shifts that had passed silently over the region. Even small cracks in the soil carried significance, potentially revealing water infiltration or temperature fluctuations over centuries. The preservation environment seemed improbable given the Gobi's known volatility, prompting speculation that the site possessed a natural anomaly or geological quirk that had shielded the fossils from the typical decay that claimed so many other specimens. Gloves, brushes and sieves moved in precise choreography as teams worked to extract each piece without damage, documenting every detail with photographs and field notes. Each fragment was measured, labelled and catalogued, with careful attention to orientation and surrounding sediment. The excavation unfolded like a meticulous choreography, where even the slightest lapse could jeopardise both scientific accuracy and the physical integrity of the specimens. Every morning began with site inspections. Every evening ended with detailed reports, and the rhythm of labour reinforced the gravity of discovery. Field scientists noted a heightened sense of anticipation, a silent acknowledgement that the site's richness was both a scientific boon and a responsibility, its treasures delicate, irreplaceable, and potentially world-changing. Strange shifts in soil consistency and minor collapses of sediment puzzled the researchers, who could not immediately identify a cause, leaving the site seemingly alive with hidden movement. Small depressions appeared overnight. Some fragments seemed to settle differently than before, and the team began to wonder if subtle geological processes were at work beneath the surface. These anomalies did not threaten the bones directly, but hinted at forces that were not yet fully understood. Field geologists examined the surrounding strata and noted that localized tremors, seasonal contraction, and moisture variations could contribute to micro-movements, yet none of these factors fully accounted for the sudden, uneven changes observed at the excavation site. The sense of a living, shifting environment added a layer of tension to the methodical work, suggesting that the site had more to reveal or conceal than anyone anticipated. By the next morning, portions of the cache had vanished entirely, leaving only empty impressions and scattered debris as if the fossils had dissolved back into the earth. The researchers returned to discover gaps where bones had rested, the soil subtly disturbed yet offering no clear explanation. Some fragments remained, yet the disappearance of key specimens rendered the overall picture incomplete, frustrating efforts to analyse patterns and connections. There were no signs of human interference, no tracks or tools suggesting theft, and no environmental events significant enough to account for the sudden loss. The emptiness was profound, and its implications chilling. A site once rich with prehistoric life now appeared to mock human attempts at comprehension, as if the desert itself had claimed its treasures once more. Teams retraced every step, measured the terrain and examined weather data, considering wind, erosion or human interference, yet no explanation fully accounted for the sudden loss. Field scientists combed the area with magnets, fine mesh screens, and even remote sensing equipment, seeking subtle clues overlooked in initial surveys. Historical weather records revealed no storms or sandstorms capable of uprooting and carrying away their remains. Satellite imagery showed only slight shifts in sediment patterns, none sufficient to remove the fossils entirely. Investigators debated whether unknown subterranean processes, small-scale seismic activity, or rare desert phenomena might be responsible. Each hypothesis seemed plausible on paper, yet failed to align with the observable facts, leaving the team oscillating between scientific rigour and the unsettling sense of inexplicable forces at work. Villagers in nearby settlements spoke of odd phenomena at Gobi, from unexplained sounds to sightings of shapes moving beneath the ground, tales that had previously been dismissed but now seemed eerily relevant. These oral accounts described creaking noises deep within the sediment, occasional tremors that startled livestock, and fleeting impressions of movement visible only at the periphery of vision. While many dismissed such stories as folklore, the coincidence with the fossil cache's disappearance sparked renewed interest among the research team. Anthropologists and geologists alike noted that local knowledge often preserved observations overlooked by scientific instruments, and the alignment of anecdotal evidence with the sudden vanishing of the cache prompted a cautious reconsideration of how human perception and environmental phenomena might intersect. Repeated surveys and mapping failed to reveal the fossils, leaving the disappearance unresolved, a puzzle that challenged both field scientists and theoretical models of preservation and sediment movement. Attempts to reconstruct the site using photogrammetry, soil analysis, and comparative stratigraphy produced incomplete results, highlighting the gaps left by the vanished specimens. The remaining bones offered tantalizing clues but could not substitute for the full context of the cache, leaving a void in both research and understanding. The discrepancy between meticulous documentation and the empty impressions of the missing fossils created tension between certainty and speculation, forcing even the most experienced paleontologists to confront the limits of observation and interpretation in the Gobi's unpredictable environment. The site remains a silent witness, its vanished treasures hinting at a history that may never fully be unearthed. The stone circles of Tsoktavu. A series of stone formations gradually emerged through the shifting heat haze, their circular arrangements becoming clearer as the team approached, each monolith positioned with deliberate precision that seemed to defy chance. At first glance, the stones appeared scattered, irregular, but as the explorers drew closer, the geometric order became undeniable. Circles of varying size rose from the arid terrain, some stones towering like silent sentinels while others lay low, embedded in the dusty soil. The sheer precision of placement suggested intention, yet no historical record could definitively explain the purpose behind these arrangements. Every observer felt a subtle tension, a quiet insistence that the site held knowledge that was at once ancient and elusive, inviting scrutiny yet resisting understanding. Careful measurement revealed concentric rings, varying diameters, and unusually uniform spacing, with some stones reaching over 2 meters in height while others barely cleared ankle level. The larger stones formed primary circles, with smaller stones creating nested rings or radial extensions that radiated outward in patterns difficult to categorize. Some groups were nearly perfect in symmetry, while others deviated slightly, creating irregularities that suggested either human error or an intentional design that remains indecipherable. Archaeologists noted the striking consistency of stone size within individual circles, the careful alignment with subtle variations, and the deliberate gaps that interrupted otherwise continuous lines, hinting at an underlying logic or cultural code that has been lost to time. Historical references to Tsoktavu suggested that these stone circles had been noted centuries ago, yet their origin, builders, and purpose remained subjects of speculation among scholars and local historians. Early travellers recorded them in passing, often attributing the formations to nomadic herders or ancient ritual practices, yet no records confirmed their construction or the people responsible. Some theories proposed astronomical significance, aligning with the solstices or other celestial events, while others suggested territorial or ceremonial functions, perhaps linked to seasonal migration routes or local spiritual beliefs. The scarcity of corroborating artifacts near the site intensified the mystery, leaving historians reliant on partial observations, oral traditions, and conjecture. Lines drawn between certain stones aligned with cardinal points and subtle celestial markers, hinting at knowledge of astronomy or ritual significance beyond contemporary understanding. Observers discovered that some stones marked sunrise or sunset during equinoxes, while others intersected at points where planets or the moon might rise, suggesting a sophisticated awareness of celestial cycles. Yet these alignments were neither universal nor consistently precise, leaving room for interpretation. The possibility that the builders possessed advanced astronomical knowledge challenges assumptions about prehistoric societies in the Gobi Desert, creating tension between observable evidence and the limits of modern understanding. Surveying equipment, compasses, and measuring tapes moved across the site as the team painstakingly documented angles, gaps, and the subtle undulations of the underlying terrain. Each circle was mapped with meticulous attention, noting the orientation of individual stones, erosion patterns, and microtopography. Photographs captured shadows cast at different times of day, revealing features invisible at a glance, while sketches recorded anomalies that might have been overlooked by instruments alone. The methodical work underscored both the discipline required to study the site and the overwhelming complexity of its design, reinforcing the sense that every stone, every gap carried significance that may never be fully understood. Some stones bore faint carvings, seemingly eroded yet still visible, while isolated patches of the soil between rings displayed irregular magnetic readings that puzzled the geophysicists. The carvings consisted of shallow grooves and abstract shapes, partially obscured by wind and sand abrasion, but still hinting at symbolic meaning. Magnetic anomalies did not conform to typical geological patterns, raising questions about the local mineral composition or previously unknown subterranean features. These irregularities challenged the team to reconcile the physical evidence with interpretations based on human intention, forcing them to consider factors that lay beyond conventional archaeological practice. Each discovery complicated the narrative, layering intrigue upon an already enigmatic site. Archaeologists debated whether the circles were ceremonial, astronomical, or territorial markers, each theory supported by fragments of evidence, but none conclusive enough to settle the question. One hypothesis suggested the rings functioned as gathering points for ritual observances, while another considered them markers of celestial events or seasonal cycles. Some proposed that the circles served as markers for migration routes, guiding nomadic herders across the shifting desert terrain. Even with these competing interpretations, the site resisted definitive explanation, its precision and irregularity simultaneously supporting and undermining each theory. The ambiguity preserved the site's mystique, a silent challenge to those who sought certainty in the evidence. Elders from nearby settlements recounted stories of lights moving along the rings at dusk and sounds of chanting carried by the wind, tales that were often dismissed but persisted across generations. Some described fleeting shadows that seemed to circle the stones when no one was present, while others spoke of feelings of vertigo or disorientation when standing within certain rings. These anecdotes, while anecdotal and unverified, echoed the tangible mysteries observed by scientists, bridging human experience with the physical peculiarities of the site. The persistence of these stories reinforced the sense that the circles were not merely static artifacts, but points of interaction between environment, human perception, and possibly unknown forces. Detailed mapping, careful measurements, and comparison with similar formations elsewhere failed to reveal a definitive explanation, leaving the site an enduring puzzle that challenged conventional archaeological reasoning. Despite exhaustive study, researchers could not account for the combination of precise arrangement, selective irregularities, faint carvings, and anomalous readings beneath the surface. Attempts to correlate the circles with known cultural practices or astronomical events produced partial insights, yet the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Scholars acknowledged the limits of current methodologies, recognizing that some aspects of the site might elude interpretation indefinitely, preserved in ambiguity as carefully as the stones themselves had been preserved by time. The silent circles remain, their ordered stones hinting at a knowledge and purpose that may forever lie just beyond human comprehension. The ghostly lights over the middle Gobi. The first flicker appeared on the horizon just as twilight settled over the desert, a pale shimmer that seemed to hover with a purpose beyond ordinary starlight. At first, it was dismissed as the reflection of a distant campfire or an atmospheric quirk, but as minutes passed, the glow intensified and moved with an almost deliberate rhythm. Observers watching from a ridge felt a peculiar mix of awe and unease, noting that the lights did not behave like any familiar celestial body or terrestrial phenomenon. Across the sand and rock, the illumination flickered and pulsed, as though the desert itself had begun to breathe in patterns only partially visible to human eyes, inviting scrutiny and a creeping sense of mystery. Observers noted the light's colours shifting from deep amber to ghostly blue, sometimes splitting into multiple points that moved independently yet in unison across the darkened sky. The forms occasionally traced slow arcs, then abruptly changed direction, hovering as if considering some unknown path. Each pulse and drift seemed synchronized, almost choreographed, defying the erratic behavior expected of natural atmospheric effects. Witnesses described the glow as ethereal, almost liquid in quality, casting strange shadows on nearby dunes and reflecting faintly off rocky outcrops. The varying intensity and motion suggested an origin that was neither fixed nor random, leaving scientists and local onlookers alike perplexed. Ancient chronicles and local oral traditions spoke of similar luminous displays, often described as omens or spirits, appearing in the same region for generations without predictable patterns. Early travellers' diaries noted wandering lights that would rise at dusk, vanish without warning, and sometimes reappear in entirely different locations. Herder families passed down stories of spectral movements over grazing lands, emphasizing that the phenomena were often accompanied by an unnatural hush, as if the desert itself held its breath. These accounts, while fragmentary and occasionally inconsistent, reinforced the notion that the lights were not a recent occurrence, suggesting a long-standing enigma embedded in the Middle Gobi's history. Instruments were deployed to measure electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature gradients, and atmospheric ionization, but the readings rarely matched the timing or intensity of the observed lights. Photographers attempted long exposure shots, capturing occasional streaks or blurs, yet the images often failed to convey the phenomenon's full complexity. Meteorological data suggested conditions capable of mirages or electrical discharges, but the observed precision and apparent coordination of the lights remained unexplained. Even the most meticulous recordings could not fully replicate the experience of watching them in person, emphasizing the ephemeral and elusive nature of the displays. The vast expanses of the Middle Gobi, with their low humidity, high plateaus and shifting air currents, provided conditions that could distort perception, yet none fully explained the precision and coordination of the lights. Winds stirred loose sand that occasionally glinted in the moonlight, but such reflections could not account for the movement patterns, altitude changes, or color transitions. The flatness of some regions allowed distant horizons to stretch unbroken, yet the lights sometimes seemed to appear almost vertically above observers, impossible to reconcile with known topography. These environmental factors compounded the mystery, blending tangible observations with visual illusions in ways that both clarified and complicated understanding. Occasionally, thermal imaging cameras recorded subtle heat signatures that coincided with the light's movements, revealing patterns invisible to the naked eye and suggesting that the phenomena might involve unusual interactions between atmospheric layers and ground-level temperature variations. Researchers noted that some light formations seemed to correspond with small rises in surface temperature, detectable only with sensitive equipment. The patterns did not match conventional meteorological or geothermal activity in the region. The heat signatures were fleeting and inconsistent, sometimes appearing in clusters, sometimes alone, adding to the unpredictability of the lights. These findings hinted at a possible connection between the desert's unique topography, temperature fluctuations, and the ghostly lights, though no concrete explanation emerged. Sudden bursts of movement, vertical rises, or rapid disappearances confounded even the most seasoned observers, leaving the lights to seem almost sentient in their patterns. One night, a cluster of lights rose in unison, paused mid-air, then scattered in different directions within seconds, as if responding to an unseen signal. At other times, the glow would vanish entirely, leaving the desert dark for hours before returning in the same or slightly altered formation. The unpredictability of these movements created a tension in observers, who could only record, speculate, and wait, aware that no known mechanism adequately explained such behavior. Researchers debated natural explanations, from ball lightning to mirages, while some suggested meteoric debris or rare atmospheric plasma phenomena, each theory partially compelling but none conclusive. Ball lightning could account for brief, localized flashes, yet the sustained and coordinated nature of the lights exceeded such events. Mirage effects might produce the illusion of motion, but would not generate the vivid colors observed across different elevations and distances. Some considered ionization of minerals or magnetic disturbances, but measurements remained inconclusive. Each proposed explanation offered pieces of understanding, yet the whole phenomenon remained stubbornly resistant to rational categorization. Nomadic herders recounted the lights as messengers or protective spirits, noting that animals often reacted with unease or avoidance whenever the luminous forms appeared above grazing grounds. Camels and horses would sometimes pause mid-step, ears alert, or move in sudden, coordinated patterns away from the glow. Such behavioral anomalies reinforced the notion that the lights exerted a tangible presence, influencing both humans and animals in ways not entirely explainable by physics alone. These stories, passed through generations, created a cultural lens through which the lights were interpreted as mystical or sacred, further intertwining human experience with the ongoing mystery of the desert skies. Extended fieldwork, photographic documentation, and triangulation attempts failed to yield a consistent explanation, leaving the lights elusive and unpredictable in character. Teams returning night after night found variations in timing, form, and behavior that undermined any single hypothesis. Observers noted that environmental factors such as cloud cover, wind direction, and temperature inversions occasionally affected visibility, but these variables could not fully account for the complexity, color shifts, or sudden accelerations. The interplay of science, human perception, and atmospheric conditions created a puzzle that remained partially visible, tantalizing in its beauty yet frustrating in its refusal to conform to logic. Night after night, the ghostly lights glide above the middle Gobi, as if the desert itself were holding secrets just beyond human perception. The unmarked cairns of Gobi. A faint line of stones stretched across the low ridge, subtle enough that casual travellers might pass without notice, yet the careful stacking hinted at deliberate intent. At first glance they seemed inconsequential, yet their distribution suggested purpose, as though someone, or some group, had marked the desert with an invisible design. Observers approaching the stones felt an immediate curiosity, a quiet tension that rose from the uncertainty of whether these formations were practical, symbolic, or ritualistic in origin. Each cairn seemed modest and unassuming, yet together they formed a silent presence across the sands, challenging every expectation of human construction in such an inhospitable landscape. Each cairn was modest in size, built from locally sourced stones stacked with varying precision, some barely reaching knee-height while others rose nearly a metre above the sand. The stones were rough-hewn and unpolished, yet arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate choice rather than random accumulation. Certain cairns displayed faint grooves or subtle indentations, as if touched or shifted by hands long absent. The unadorned structures, devoid of inscriptions or recognizable symbols, carried a quiet authority, suggesting meaning held not in decoration but in their very existence, compelling anyone who stumbled upon them to wonder about the intent behind their placement. Clusters and isolated cairns extended over miles, their placement neither fully regular nor entirely random, hinting at a purpose that was systematic yet opaque. In some areas, the stones formed lines that intersected with distant ridges, while in others, the cairns were scattered in what seemed like an arbitrary pattern. Attempts to map the formations revealed irregular grids, sequences that repeated with subtle variation, and alignments that sometimes coincided with celestial markers. The diversity of layout created a complex spatial puzzle suggesting a knowledge of geometry or observation that survived without any recorded explanation. Scattered references in local oral histories spoke of cairns that guided travellers or marked ritual sites, though no written records confirmed their age or origin. Herders and nomads recounted stories of cairns that seemed to appear suddenly or change subtly when approached at different times of the day, lending an air of mystery to the landscape. Some elders insisted that the stones were placed as warnings or memorials, while others described them as navigation aids along long-forgotten trade routes. These anecdotes, though fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, created a tapestry of folklore that intertwined human perception with the desert's enduring enigma. Geologists and archaeologists measured angles, spacing, and stone composition, hoping to identify patterns linked to terrain, solar events, or migration routes. Surveys examined the alignment of cairns relative to distant hills, seasonal sunrises, and even occasional riverbeds that once cut across the desert. Soil analysis and stratigraphy provided clues to the stone's stability and possible antiquity, yet results were inconclusive. Despite precise measurements and modern instruments, each team encountered irregularities that resisted interpretation, as though the cairns were designed to challenge conventional reasoning rather than conform to it. Occasionally, thermal imaging cameras detected faint heat variations around some cairns, subtle enough that only sensitive equipment could register them. These minor anomalies did not correspond to sunlight or recent activity and appeared sporadically, sometimes in isolated stones, sometimes in clusters. While inconclusive, the reading suggested that the cairns might interact with their environment in ways not fully understood, whether through the desert's microclimate, reflection of residual solar heat, or another unknown phenomenon. Such fleeting observations added another layer to the mystery, hinting at complexity hidden within the simplicity of the stone stacks. Some cairns aligned with distant horizons or faint celestial markers, while others appeared deliberately offset, creating an irregular network that defied conventional mapping expectations. Observers noted that lines of stones occasionally converged toward points of elevation or followed routes visible only from certain vantage points. Attempts to overlay star charts and topographical maps yielded partial correlations, though no single alignment explained the full arrangement. These irregularities implied intentionality, yet refused to reveal a clear message, leaving researchers with questions about the knowledge, culture, or beliefs that guided the original builders. Recent drone surveys revealed subtle variations in stone coloration and lichen growth across the cairns, suggesting that some had remained undisturbed for decades, while others might have been altered or reconstructed at unknown intervals. High-resolution imagery allowed researchers to detect faint microcracks and shifts in individual stones, patterns invisible from ground level but hinting at environmental influences such as wind vortices, temperature fluctuations, or occasional seismic tremors. These observations introduced a new layer of complexity, implying that the cairns were not static objects, but elements subtly interacting with the desert over time, challenging assumptions about permanence and human intention. Debates ranged from navigational aids for nomadic herders to territorial markers or memorials, each hypothesis supported by fragments of evidence, but none fully explaining the scale or variation. Some experts suggested the stones marked seasonal grazing boundaries or signalling points along caravan paths. Others proposed spiritual or ritualistic purposes, connecting cairns to ceremonies or offerings. Astronomical interpretations were also considered, with certain cairns potentially corresponding to solstice or equinox positions. Each theory offered compelling aspects, yet none could account for the entirety of the formations, leaving their true purpose suspended between evidence and speculation. Nomads described feelings of unease when passing certain clusters, claiming the cairns sometimes appeared differently depending on the time of day or the observer's approach. Shadows shifted unexpectedly among the stones, and faint winds seemed to whisper through gaps in ways that heightened awareness of the desert's quiet vastness. Some claimed that approaching too closely disturbed an intangible presence, while stepping back seemed to restore a sense of equilibrium. These personal accounts, though anecdotal, lent the cairns a psychological dimension, intertwining perception, belief, and the desert environment in ways that modern instruments could not quantify. Shifting sands, wind erosion, and seasonal storms obscured older stones and occasionally buried or dislodged cairns, complicating efforts to map and interpret the formations accurately. Entire sections of cairn lines could vanish beneath drifting dunes, only to re-emerge partially in subsequent seasons. The ephemeral nature of these markers underscored their vulnerability to the desert's forces, yet some had persisted for generations, seemingly resistant to time itself. Observers were left to piece together partial sequences and fragmented alignments, creating hypotheses that remained incomplete but tantalizingly suggestive of a lost system of knowledge. Through meticulous study and extensive fieldwork, the unmarked cairns of Gobi continue to guard their secrets, silently challenging every attempt to discern their purpose. The fossil eggs that changed position. The excavation team noticed the first clutch of fossilized eggs nestled in a shallow depression, each carefully encased in sediment that had preserved their fragile forms for millions of years. The site was quiet except for the occasional whisper of desert wind, yet it carried a sense of anticipation as the researchers carefully brushed away layers of sand to reveal the rounded forms. Each egg, perfectly intact, seemed to hold a moment of history frozen in stone, yet as the team observed, a subtle unease settled over them. The arrangement of the eggs appeared too precise, too deliberate to be a random cluster, and curiosity demanded close attention to detail. The site itself was a gently sloping area of compacted sand and clay, surrounded by low ridges that provided natural shelter and a vantage point for observing other fossil clusters scattered across the plain. Shadows of the ridges shifted slowly with the rising sun, revealing minute variations in the terrain that might explain some displacements, yet nothing seemed sufficient to account for the anomalies the team would soon record. Small fragments of broken eggshell lay half buried nearby, remnants of natural processes over millennia, but the eggs of primary interest remained intact, as though resistant to the desert's gradual erosion. Researchers meticulously photographed, measured and catalogued each egg, noting subtle variations in size, orientation and depth, creating a detailed record meant to withstand the desert's shifting conditions. Each stone and sediment sample was labelled and preserved, providing a baseline for future comparison, with notes on microcracks and alignment relative to nearby formations. Even minor inclines and depressions were recorded, for the team understood that in the Gobi Desert, a few centimetres of slope or a small sand ridge could influence fragile fossils. Their diligence seemed certain to capture the complete picture of this ancient site. Upon returning weeks later, several eggs were found in positions that did not correspond with the original measurements, their movement unexplained by wind, erosion, or animal activity. The team carefully retraced their previous steps, checking all notes and photographs, and the discrepancy became undeniable. Eggs that had once rested on gentle inclines now appeared slightly rotated or shifted, sometimes by several centimetres, without any trace of disturbance in the surrounding soil. The movement was subtle, yet precise enough to defy coincidence or natural expectation. Traces in the surrounding sediment showed no clear tracks, disturbances, or signs of natural displacement, leaving the team perplexed at how intact eggs could shift without apparent cause. The surface remained firm, undisturbed, and free from animal prints, suggesting that no mammal or reptile had interacted with the site. Even microscopic examination of soil compaction and tiny depressions revealed no pattern that could account for the subtle adjustments in egg positions. The anomaly existed quietly but undeniably, challenging both intuition and established paleontological methodology. Geologists examined soil composition and compactness, biologists considered subterranean animal activity, and climatologists studied micro-weather patterns, yet no conventional explanation reconciled the observations. The clay and sand surrounding the eggs showed normal desiccation patterns, and the rare rainfall during the previous weeks was insufficient to shift large fossilized objects. Small burrowing animals in the region were unable to reach the egg's depth without disturbing surrounding soil, which remained remarkably intact. Each hypothesis was tested, each environmental factor scrutinized, and each potential explanation proved inadequate, leaving an increasing sense of mystery. Advanced imaging techniques later revealed faint stratification lines within the surrounding sediment, subtle variations in mineral density that had previously gone unnoticed. These layers suggested micro-movements of sand and clay over time. But even with this insight, the magnitude and precision of the egg's displacement could not be explained by normal geological processes. Researchers noted that temperature-induced expansion and contraction of the soil occurred daily, yet the pattern of egg rotation was inconsistent with the directional stresses these cycles would produce. The anomaly remained persistent, implying that some factor, mechanical, environmental, or otherwise, was acting in a way the team had yet to comprehend. Historical records of other fossil sites in the Gobi Desert revealed occasional reports of slight shifts in egg positions, though none were documented with the same precision or frequency. Accounts from early 20th century expeditions mentioned misaligned clutches and unexplainable rotations, but these records were largely anecdotal, lacking photographic evidence or precise measurements. The recurrence of such observations across decades hinted at a phenomenon occasionally encountered but rarely quantified, suggesting the Gobi Desert harboured subtleties that had long escaped scientific understanding. Local herders spoke of sleeping eggs in desert lore, objects that moved with their own rhythm, hinting at a cultural memory entwined with centuries of observation in the region. Elders described the eggs as silent witnesses of a time long past, objects that sometimes changed position when unobserved. And while these tales were often dismissed as superstition, they intriguingly aligned with the team's own experience. The blend of science and folklore created an atmosphere where both explanation and wonder coexisted, leaving the researchers unsettled by the gap between the physical evidence and its implications. Extreme temperatures, sudden sandstorms, and the remote location complicated repeated site visits, making continuous monitoring both physically demanding and scientifically critical. Equipment had to be carefully transported across miles of shifting dunes, and minor errors in placement or measurement could produce misleading results. Even with daily observation, minor environmental changes could mask or reveal minute shifts in egg positioning, challenging the team's ability to capture consistent, reliable data. Each visit confirmed the anomaly persisted, yet it remained impossible to fully control for the desert's subtle influence on fragile sediment. After numerous surveys and detailed analysis, the egg's movements remained unexplained, provoking debate among specialists about whether the phenomenon reflected unknown natural forces or something entirely beyond current understanding. Hypotheses ranged from unseen seismic vibrations to unexplored soil dynamics or the influence of rare microclimatic events. No theory satisfactorily accounted for the precision of movement or the lack of visible traces, and discussions often ended with the acknowledgement that some mysteries of the Gobi Desert were resistant to explanation, leaving scientists both frustrated and fascinated. The fossil eggs that shifted without warning continue to puzzle those who witness them, quietly challenging the boundary between the observable past and the mysteries that linger beneath the desert sands. The sand-swallowed caravan near Sainsand. The travellers paused at a narrow pass, arranging their camels and goods with careful precision, unaware that the desert ahead would soon obscure them from sight without a trace. Each camel's bridle was checked, packs secured and supplies counted, the muted sounds of shifting rope and the quiet murmurs of preparation filling the dry air. There was a rhythm to their movements, practiced and careful, yet beneath the surface of routine lay an unspoken tension. The desert had long been a place of sudden changes, where even well-prepared caravans could face dangers beyond anticipation. As the sun climbed and shadow shifted, the travellers continued, their path winding between low ridges and sandy hollows that promised both passage and uncertainty. The desert stretched in irregular ridges and shallow valleys, where gusts of wind carried fine sand that crept imperceptibly over tracks and footprints, erasing the memory of passage almost as quickly as it formed. Each ridge seemed to conceal its own secrets, a subtle rise or dip altering how the caravan was seen from a distance. Temperatures varied sharply between sunlit dunes and sheltered hollows, forcing travellers to adjust their pace, their clothing, and even the load carried by the camels. Such conditions demanded vigilance. Even a moment's distraction could allow the desert's shifting sands to obscure the faintest trace of movement, leaving only questions for those who would follow. Nomadic herders in distant hills noted the caravan's progress, remarking on the unusual quiet that fell over the dunes as the travellers advanced, as if the desert itself watched their movement. Occasionally a herder would pause, adjusting a scarf against the rising wind, squinting toward the horizon where the tiny figures of the caravan faded and returned in the undulating heat. Some described a sudden stillness, an almost imperceptible change in the air, as though the desert were holding its breath, a feeling familiar to those who had travelled these routes for generations. Such observations, though anecdotal, would later gain significance in piecing together the caravan's final movements. When the caravan reached a low, wind-sculpted hollow, observers later reported that it seemed to vanish into the sand, with no trace of struggle, detour, or warning left behind. Tracks faded abruptly, camel footprints dissolving into smooth, unmarked slopes, as though the desert had swallowed both beasts and travellers in a single deliberate gesture. Those witnessing the disappearance at a distance recalled a peculiar shimmer, the play of heat and light giving the impression of movement even where there was none. By the time any attempt at pursuit began, the hollow appeared unchanged, the sand unbroken, and the caravan itself had been rendered invisible to all eyes. Passers-by retraced the expected route with urgency, scanning the dunes for footprints, camel tracks, or remnants of equipment, but found nothing beyond the desert's shifting surface. Simple tools, ropes, saddles, small bags might have indicated a struggle, yet not one item was recovered in the initial search. The lack of debris or disturbance deepened the mystery, for even the gentlest of storms would typically leave some mark, however faint. Observers found themselves questioning not only what had happened, but also whether natural forces alone could account for the sudden disappearance of a caravan so visible only moments before. The team of explorers combed the area with methodical care, measuring wind patterns, mapping dunes, and probing soft sand for signs of buried objects, yet results remained frustratingly inconclusive. Modern tools, including ground-penetrating radar and GPS tracking, provided little insight. Subtle depressions hinted at movement beneath the surface but revealed no distinct shapes or outlines. Analysts considered every possibility, from sudden sinkholes to shifting dunes hiding cavities, but each hypothesis seemed either too implausible or insufficient to explain the complete erasure of the caravan's presence. The desert, as always, retained its secret. Scattered along the presumed route, small fragments of pottery and metal fittings hinted at previous trade activity, suggesting that this area had long been a crossroads for caravans, yet also a place where items could vanish inexplicably. Investigators catalogued these remnants meticulously, noting patterns in their distribution that might indicate sudden events, such as sand collapses or brief but powerful gusts, capable of burying artifacts almost immediately after they were left behind. These scattered traces, though mundane in isolation, became part of a larger puzzling pattern that pointed to the desert's capacity for both concealment and preservation, challenging assumptions about what could disappear without a trace. In some areas, subtle depressions suggested temporary impressions of animals or wheels, but they did not correspond with the caravan's known path, leaving an unsettling ambiguity between reality and conjecture. At times, one might find a shallow indentation that seemed to match a camel's hoof, only to realise that the surrounding sand betrayed no consistent pattern. Archaeologists and desert specialists debated whether these anomalies were natural, a product of wind and moisture, or evidence of something entirely unrecorded in the annals of desert travel. Each explanation faltered under scrutiny, leaving an unshakable sense that the caravan's fate existed beyond ordinary understanding. The route near Sanjand had long been part of trade networks connecting oases and settlements, and local lore spoke of travellers lost to sudden storms or dunes that seemed to swallow entire caravans without trace. Ancient stories told of caravans disappearing overnight, leaving behind nothing but faint whispers carried on the wind and scattered personal items found decades later. For generations, traders treated the region with caution, respecting both the practical dangers of shifting sands and the eerie, unverified accounts of those who had vanished. The combination of history and legend lent a haunting weight to the investigation, as researchers attempted to reconcile empirical evidence with tales handed down across centuries. Blinding sandstorms, rapid temperature shifts, and deep drifts made detailed surveying nearly impossible, forcing teams to rely on fragmented observations and partial measurements of the vanished caravan's supposed course. Protective measures, tents, vehicles, and temporary markers proved insufficient against the desert's relentless force, and each delay in observation increased the difficulty of determining what had occurred. Even experienced desert trackers admitted that the environment could create illusions, conceal movements, and obscure patterns, complicating any attempt at explanation. In such conditions, certainty remained elusive, and every discovery prompted more questions than answers. Despite careful documentation and repeated field investigations, the caravan's disappearance remains unresolved, its fate hidden beneath layers of sand and uncertainty, a reminder of the desert's relentless and unyielding mystery. The buried ruins at Noyon Ul. Footsteps crunched across the uneven terrain as the team approached Noyon Ul, where outlines of walls emerged sporadically from windblown sand. At first, they appeared like scattered fragments of a forgotten settlement, partially buried beneath centuries of desert erosion. Yet closer inspection revealed more than random decay. Subtle alignments and partial enclosures suggested deliberate construction, raising questions about the people who had built them and the purpose these spaces had once served. The desert's silence pressed in from every side, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind through the rocks, emphasizing the isolation of a site that had somehow survived undisturbed for centuries. Jagged fragments of masonry hinted at rooms and corridors, their arrangement neither simple nor easily interpreted. The stones varied in size and shape, some squared with careful precision, others roughly chipped yet thoughtfully positioned, creating a rhythm across the ruins that felt intentional. Walls rose in partial lengths, their tops crumbling yet still providing a sense of the original scale. The pattern of erosion was inconsistent, as if certain sections had resisted time more effectively than others, an anomaly that prompted the team to examine the stones more closely for clues of their original configuration or structural purpose. Certain spaces met at irregular angles, and corridors ended abruptly, suggesting a design that defied conventional habitation logic. Some chambers connected through narrow passageways that seemed inconvenient for routine movement, while others opened into larger halls whose exact function was unclear. A few stone floors were unusually smooth compared with surrounding surfaces, hinting at specialized use or repeated activity, yet no artifacts directly explained these features. Investigators began to consider whether the builders had followed a specific ritual or ceremonial design, rather than purely practical considerations, though evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. Fragments of pottery, tools, and stone implements lay partially embedded in sediment layers that had hardened over centuries. Small shards of ceramic, worn by age but otherwise intact, suggested domestic activity, while stone tools reflected craftsmanship and utility. Despite centuries of exposure to wind and shifting sands, the artifacts remained largely in situ, carefully layered beneath hardened sediment, giving the impression that the site had been deliberately abandoned or sealed. Each item became a clue, yet together they formed a puzzle with no immediate answer, their placement hinting at intentionality that modern observation could not fully decode. Every wall and depression was charted in painstaking detail, with measurements capturing subtle inclines, misalignments, and variations in stone placement. Survey teams used total stations and 3D mapping technology to create precise models of the ruins, allowing for later comparative analysis and reconstruction attempts. Every discrepancy, every slight deviation in wall alignment or floor gradient was documented, and teams debated whether these irregularities represented errors, adaptations to terrain, or deliberate design choices. The desert offered no hints beyond what was physically present, leaving interpretation to careful study and cross-disciplinary collaboration. The ruins' structural features differed markedly from known desert settlements, including unusual terracing and enclosures aligned to obscure topographical points. Some walls appeared to guide movement along specific sightlines, while others obstructed or terminated abruptly, a combination of intentionality and enigma. Comparisons to other Gobi Desert ruins highlighted both similarities and stark contrasts, suggesting that Noyon Uyuel may have belonged to a unique cultural or architectural tradition. The lack of comparable sites challenged researchers to contextualize the ruins, forcing them to balance observed evidence against broader assumptions about regional settlement patterns. Delicate incisions and faint symbols etched into the stones hinted at ritualistic or functional intent, their meanings obscured by time and erosion. Weathering had softened the edges, leaving shapes that were difficult to distinguish, yet under careful lighting they became more apparent. Parallel lines, concentric circles, and faint geometric patterns. These markings did not resemble typical decorative motifs found elsewhere in the Gobi Desert, and their subtlety suggested either symbolic significance or coded communication meant for a select few. Each researcher interpreted them differently, adding to the layered mystery that pervaded the site. Stories passed down by local herders described Noyon Uyuel as a place where echoes of past inhabitants lingered, its walls said to shift subtly under the moonlight. Oral accounts spoke of sudden drafts, faint sounds, or visual impressions that seemed inexplicable, blending natural phenomena with folklore. While anecdotal, these tales provided context for the ruins' enigmatic reputation, suggesting a cultural memory that extended beyond tangible evidence. Nomads recounted journeys along Noyon Ul's slopes with reverence and caution, emphasizing the site's persistent presence in the collective imagination of desert travelers. Analysis of soil and sediment revealed compacted layers and unexpected mineral concentrations inconsistent with natural deposition patterns, leaving investigators perplexed. Some strata contained harder-than-expected conglomerations of sand and clay, suggesting processes that preserved structural integrity beyond normal geological expectation. Tests indicated the presence of mineralization that could have contributed to the remarkable preservation of walls and floors, though how these formations interacted with environmental forces remained unclear. The anomaly challenged conventional understanding of desert sedimentology, hinting at forces or circumstances not yet identified by science. Evidence suggested intermittent occupation, with some structures modified repeatedly and others left untouched, hinting at selective use or unknown cultural practices. Certain walls displayed multiple phases of construction, with additions and repairs evident in subtle changes in stone size and mortar composition. In contrast, other areas remained entirely static, untouched by human hands for centuries. This duality within a single site suggested intentional spatial division, possibly separating functional, ceremonial, or restricted zones. Yet the reasoning behind these choices was lost to time. Surviving centuries of sandstorms and temperature extremes, several walls and surfaces retained sharp definition, a preservation anomaly that defied environmental expectations. Some stones retained crisp edges while adjacent materials crumbled, implying local conditions or structural techniques that enhanced durability. Microclimate effects, combined with the composition of certain stone types, may have contributed, but no single explanation accounted for the consistency of preservation across multiple structures. Each observation reinforced the impression that the ruins had survived under conditions that should have eroded them long ago. Interpretations ranged from military outpost to religious site, yet no single theory reconciled the unusual layouts, preservation patterns, and artifact distribution. Military hypotheses suggested defensive features, but the irregular corridors and abrupt chamber endings contradicted conventional fortification design. Ritualistic interpretations accounted for some symbolic patterns, yet they could not explain practical construction aspects such as terraces and enclosed courtyards. Astronomical alignment theories offered additional possibilities, though no celestial correlations were consistent across the entire site. Each approach illuminated a portion of the puzzle while leaving other aspects unexplained. Subtle alignments towards distant peaks and ridges implied observational or symbolic intent, though the reasoning behind their placement remained entirely speculative. From select vantage points, walls and courtyards appeared to trace paths toward horizon points that might coincide with seasonal sunrises or other natural phenomena. The alignments could have served as signals, ceremonial markers, or practical guides across the desert landscape. Yet without written records, precise interpretation remained impossible, leaving the team to balance empirical observation against conjecture. Under the shifting sands of Noyon Uul, the ruins stand silent, guarding the intentions of builders whose secrets have endured millennia. The lingering echoes of the flaming cliffs. The flaming cliffs rise in jagged layers of red and ochre, their surfaces catching the desert sun in ways that make them appear almost aflame, as if the earth itself holds memories of a distant past. The sheer faces are carved by millennia of wind and sand, yet certain strata retain astonishing detail. Impressions of scales, teeth, and bones pressed into the sandstone as if frozen in a single, eternal moment. Early expeditions that traced the cliff's contours reported discovering fossilized remains partially protruding from the rock, some upright and others angled in unexpected ways, provoking questions about what had shaped their positioning over countless centuries. Among these cliffs, the first fossilized remnants of dinosaurs were uncovered with meticulous care, revealing skeletons embedded in sedimentary layers that suggested violent geological upheavals. Bones of velociraptor, protoceratops, and other creatures were scattered across narrow ledges or partially buried in sloping deposits, yet many remained astonishingly intact. Stratigraphic analysis indicated that sudden sandslides, flash floods, or seasonal torrents might have contributed to their final resting places, but certain formations defied explanation, showing delicate alignment that no known natural event could fully account for. Some fossils were found disarticulated or partially rotated, presenting an enigma for those observing the site. Clusters of bones appeared to have shifted just enough to alter their orientation without fracturing surrounding sediment. Layers of hardened sand and clay held impressions of these bones securely, yet subtle adjustments had occurred, suggesting forces unseen and unmeasured had been at work. These discrepancies were small, often only a few centimeters, but they'd repeated across multiple fossil clusters, creating a pattern of minor but deliberate movement that demanded closer examination. At specific hours, a low, hollow whistle travels through the sandstone, a subtle resonance that seems to change with shifting winds and temperature gradients. Observers noted that the sound varied not only in pitch but in duration and timbre, sometimes lingering across narrow canyons, at other times dissipating instantly. Attempts to recreate the effect artificially demonstrated that ordinary air currents could not produce the same tonal quality or intensity, leaving an impression that the cliffs themselves had an acoustic signature unique to their formation and composition. Sections of the cliffs exhibit temperature variations that confound expectations. Certain pockets of sandstone remain cooler than adjacent rock even at midday, while some ledges retain warmth long after the sun has dipped below the horizon. These anomalies influence the surrounding sediment, causing minute expansions and contractions in layers that hold fossils. The resulting micro-movements may partially explain subtle shifts in bone positioning, yet they do not fully account for the precision with which these ancient remains have realigned, creating questions about the forces acting over geological timeframes. Mapping the fossil deposits using high-resolution photogrammetry revealed intricate patterns of placement and orientation. Each bone, fragment, and impression was documented with precise coordinates, enabling comparison over multiple visits. Subsequent surveys showed minor but inexplicable rotations or shifts, often without any discernible cause. Wind, erosion, or animal activity could not account for these movements, and the consistency of changes across several fossil groups hinted at influences beyond immediately observable natural processes. Sediment cores drawn from key layers of the cliffs displayed alternating bands of compacted sand and fragile bone fragments. Some strata showed microfractures or compressions that did not correspond to the weight of overlying sediment, as if the bones had subtly shifted after deposition. The complexity of the sedimentary record suggested repeated interactions with environmental forces, yet not the kind ordinarily encountered in the desert. Even careful analysis of sand grain orientation, mineral composition, and moisture content failed to identify any conventional mechanism for these adjustments. Local guides and nomads have long shared stories of nights when low hums emanate from the cliffs, seemingly responding to movement or presence. Travellers describe approaching ledges and hearing a subtle vibration through these soles of their feet, or observing sand sliding along exposed rock with no visible cause. Some speak of shadows stretching differently at certain times, as if the cliffs themselves were aware of observers. Though anecdotal, these accounts reinforce the sense that the flaming cliffs harbour phenomena that extend beyond ordinary geological processes. Attempts to interpret the cliff's acoustic and sedimentary anomalies have drawn input from a range of disciplines, including paleontology, geomorphology, and atmospheric physics. Microseismic monitoring and wind simulations have offered partial explanations for some of the bone movements, yet none reconcile the full suite of observations. Temperature gradients, sound resonance, and subtle vibrations may act in concert, producing patterns that mimic intention or design, but the forces remain elusive and inconsistent, defying simple measurement or prediction. The flaming cliffs persist as a site where natural history and mystery intertwine. Fossils continue to reveal details about species that roamed the region millions of years ago, yet the inexplicable shifts in orientation, faint acoustic echoes, and temperature inconsistencies suggest that additional factors, currently unknown, influence the preservation and presentation of these remains. Each visit to the cliffs reinforces the tension between what is visible and measurable and what remains hidden, reminding observers that even the most studied landscapes retain layers of secret history. Archaeological parallels drawn with nearby formations hint at human awareness of the cliff's unusual qualities in prehistory, with early cave art and petroglyphs nearby, depicting creatures and forms reminiscent of fossils embedded in the rock. While these markings may be purely artistic, their proximity to anomalous fossil deposits raises questions about whether ancient peoples recognized patterns or energies still undetected by modern science. Such speculation merges with empirical observation, heightening the enigmatic presence of the cliffs across both geological and cultural timeframes. Repeated observation of erosion patterns reveals microchannels and depressions that can influence sediment flow in ways too subtle for standard field instruments. Small grains of sand follow unpredictable paths down ledges and into crevices, occasionally shifting bone fragments by millimeters over months or years. While this accounts for minimal movement, it cannot fully explain the coordinated rotations and repositioning evident across multiple fossil clusters, which seem to move as if guided by a hidden hand or force. The cliffs themselves, with their fiery hue and layered composition, serve as both a canvas and a record, capturing events that span millions of years. Each fossilized skeleton, each subtle fracture in stone, each whisper of air through a narrow canyon contributes to a broader narrative of mystery. The interplay of light, temperature, sound, and geological history forms a dynamic system in which even minor forces can produce significant, sometimes inexplicable, outcomes. Observers leave the site with a sense of humility, aware that the flaming cliffs hold secrets the desert has yet to fully reveal. Newly discovered ledges reveal clusters of bones arranged in ways that suggest intermittent burial by sudden sand deposits or flash floods, yet the surrounding sediment remains unusually undisturbed. Small fragments of bone occasionally protrude from rock faces, hinting at repeated cycles of exposure and coverage. Detailed imaging shows micro-shifts in positioning over weeks and months, further complicating attempts to interpret the forces at work. Each adjustment is minor, yet the precision with which it occurs seems intentional, reinforcing the sense that the cliffs themselves play an active role in the preservation and alteration of their contents. Whispered accounts from nomadic families recount nights when faint lights or glimmers appear along the cliff face, refracting off mineral surfaces in ways that defy simple explanation. Observers describe the effect as brief, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably present, a flicker of illumination that highlights fossil contours or reveals hidden fractures. Though atmospheric phenomena may play a role, the timing and placement of these lights remain inconsistent, contributing to the cliff's enduring reputation as a place where the desert itself communicates in subtle, enigmatic ways. Even as scientific tools improve, from laser scanning to high-resolution thermal imaging, the flaming cliffs retain elements that resist measurement and categorization. Each fossil cluster, echo, and microshift continues to defy simple classification, compelling those who study the cliffs to consider new possibilities about geological and environmental processes, as well as forces that may still be unrecognized. The combination of empirical evidence and persistent anomalies ensures that the site remains both scientifically valuable and profoundly mysterious. When sunlight fades, the cliff's shadows lengthen, casting deep reds and oranges across the sand, accentuating the jagged layers and fossil projections. As evening approaches, wind currents shift and faint whistling sounds drift through canyons and over ledges, a reminder of the cliff's living presence in the desert. Observation, measurement, and documentation all continue, yet some phenomena resist replication, leaving their causes unverified and their significance unresolved. Bathed in the amber glow of the desert sunset, the flaming cliffs stand as an enduring testament to the forces of time and nature, their fossils, sounds, and subtle movements quietly challenging every assumption about the desert's past and present. The mysterious collapse at Tatsien Sagan Lake. A light breeze stirred the flat, salt-crusted basin that once held Tatsien Sagan Lake, as if the desert itself remembered water that vanished long ago. For decades, scientists have noted the lake among the shifting scars of Mongolia's arid interior, yet beneath those sands lies evidence hinting at a far more dramatic secret, an abrupt collapse of the land under the lake, with no trace of earthquake or seismic upheaval. The basin now appears fractured, its once level floor broken into uneven sections that suggest sudden subsidence rather than slow erosion. Tatsien Sagan rests within the Valley of Lakes, a chain of shallow saline basins that once served as summer refuges for migratory waterfowl and other desert life. These lakes are sustained not by rivers but by fragile groundwater systems and seasonal melt from distant mountains, a delicate balance that leaves them highly vulnerable to environmental shifts. Despite its apparent simplicity, the landscape conceals layers of ancient sediment that reveal complex geological histories. Fossilized clays and mineralized deposits indicate that hydrothermal activity once reshaped the sediments below, leaving pockets of altered earth that could collapse under stress. The flatness of the lake's basin is deceptive. Sediment cores reveal sudden changes in composition, compacted layers overlying looser soils, suggesting episodes when the lake bed may have dropped dramatically. Ancient shoreline ridges and terraces around Tatsien Sagan tell of a lake once far larger and deeper than what remains today. But the abrupt sinking recorded in the sediment does not match any known climate fluctuation. Even today, remnants of these paleo shorelines can be traced as ridges of hardened clay and sand, irregularly scarred as if some hidden force tore the ground apart. Over the years, observers noticed that water would reappear in the basin during wet periods, only to retreat again, leaving behind a cracked, hollowed surface. The lakebed seems haunted by these oscillations, and the plants that cling to the salt-laden soil struggle to survive, roots stunted and leaves pale. Migratory birds that once flocked to the lake altered their flight paths, as if sensing the subtle instability of a basin that might no longer be reliable for their seasonal stopovers. Even the smallest animals seem to avoid the area, leaving an eerie silence across stretches once alive with movement. Geologists attempting to reconstruct the collapse have speculated that subterranean groundwater shifts could have undermined the lakebed. As the water table fluctuated or permafrost thawed in distant uplands, the sediments might have lost the support needed to bear their own weight. Evidence of compacted clays and altered minerals supports this theory, yet nothing definitively explains the speed or timing of the collapse. Some sections appear to have dropped in a single event, while others show gradual settling, creating a mosaic of displacement that resists straightforward explanation. Within the lakebed's depths, hidden cavities and fissures in the sediment suggest that water once moved through channels invisible to the eye, carving voids that may have triggered sudden collapses. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in adjacent basins of the Valley of Lakes reveal networks of subterranean tunnels and pockets within the sediment layers, likely formed by historical fluctuations of groundwater or permafrost melt. These voids could have compromised the structural integrity of Tatsian Sagan's lakebed, creating a scenario where even minor shifts in moisture or sediment weight might cause large sections of the basin to drop abruptly. Such formations may explain the irregular depressions and fragmented floor observed today, showing that the collapse was not merely a surface phenomenon, but rooted deep within the hidden architecture of the desert underworld. The collapse left the lake transformed. Portions of the basin now sit lower than surrounding terrain, creating depressions that trap occasional pools of water but prevent the lake from returning to its former size. Seasonal wetlands that once sustained diverse life vanish within weeks of reappearance. Life that depends on water, from small crustaceans to the birds that fed on them, faces unpredictable conditions. The basin no longer behaves like a simple lake. It has become a landscape of hollowed pockets, a desert mirror reflecting the fragility of water in a place where survival has always been precarious. Complicating the mystery, the collapse does not fit patterns observed elsewhere in the Valley of Lakes. Other basins respond slowly to drought or flood cycles, with sediment layers accumulating over centuries. Tatsian Tsagan shows abrupt changes in compaction and mineral structure, as if some hidden force caused the ground to give way, leaving the lakebed hollow and fractured. Without human records, no eyewitness account can confirm what happened. The desert holds its secrets in silence, and only the layers of earth preserve clues to events that remain otherwise invisible. Even modern mapping and satellite imagery have only partially captured the scope of the collapse. Irregular depressions and sudden shifts in elevation appear across the basin, but the causes remain speculative. Some researchers consider chemical dissolution of salts or subsurface erosion by groundwater currents. Others suggest that a combination of factors, hydrothermal alteration, drying, and underground flow, may have conspired to destabilize the lakebed. Whatever the mechanism, the result is a basin that no longer behaves like a coherent landscape, but a fractured expanse, unstable and unpredictable. Despite these observations, Tatsian Tsagan continues to intrigue and confound. Wet phases still bring life back to the basin, as crustaceans surge in number and birds return to feed. Then, as water recedes, the lake vanishes again, leaving only cracks and hollows. Vegetation struggles to establish itself, roots reaching for moisture that disappears before they can stabilize. The air seems heavier here, carrying a sense of absence, and the silence amplifies the knowledge that the land itself has shifted in ways the mind cannot fully grasp. What happened at Tatsian Tsagan may never be fully understood. The absence of seismic activity, the patchwork nature of collapsed sediments, and the ongoing oscillation of water and dry land all point to an event outside normal expectation. The lake remains a fragile and enigmatic system, one where the forces shaping the desert act with invisible hands, leaving only traces for careful observers to decipher. Scientists continue to study the basin, piecing together fragments of geological history, yet each discovery only deepens the sense of mystery. Tatsian Tsagan's basin now sits as a warning and a riddle. Life persists in fits and starts, yet the ground beneath remains unstable. Migratory birds, small crustaceans, and sparse vegetation all respond to subtle cues, adapting to the hidden rhythms of a landscape that has changed beyond recognition. Each fluctuation in water levels, each shift in sediment, reinforces the impression that the lake was altered not by ordinary means but by forces that remain largely invisible, leaving a scar across the Gobi that is as enigmatic as it is permanent. No one can say with certainty whether the collapse was sudden or gradual, natural or influenced by unseen underground currents, yet its effects are undeniable. The lake's disappearance from maps, its fractured floor, and the silences that fill its basins speak to a moment in time when the desert itself claimed a portion of its own history, leaving humanity to wonder what unseen forces continue to shape the land. Amid the cracked and sun-baked earth of Tatsian Sagan, something ancient may still be moving, waiting to reveal itself. The vanished shrine of Shinijinst. Whispers of Shinijinst lingered among the nomads, a shrine spoken of in the same breath as desert winds and long-forgotten journeys. Generations recalled travellers pausing at its threshold, leaving small offerings or bowing in silence before continuing across the dunes. The shrine's precise location has never been mapped, and today no trace of it remains on the surface, yet oral accounts suggest it once occupied a small but prominent rise where sands now drift unchecked. Despite its disappearance, Shinijinst endures in memory as a place of devotion and guidance, an anchor in a desert that seems otherwise indifferent to human presence. Early accounts suggest that small desert sanctuaries like Shinijinst served as vital waypoints for travellers, blending faith and necessity across Mongolia's arid interior. Nomadic groups historically relied on such sites to mark seasonal routes, offering prayers for safe passage and favourable conditions. Local traditions indicate that Shinijinst may have been linked to regional spiritual practices, possibly venerating natural spirits associated with water sources or weather patterns. While the exact origins are unclear, the repeated mention of Shinijinst in travel journals, oral histories, and ethnographic notes underscores its importance as both a cultural and spiritual landmark, whose significance extended beyond the immediate community to encompass the larger desert landscape. Elders recount festivals and pilgrimages with a clarity that belies the absence of any physical trace, describing incense smoke rising above sand dunes long vanished. Travellers recalled rituals conducted at dawn, with prayers uttered in quiet unison and small offerings of food or symbolic objects left in carefully arranged piles. Some elders described faint markings on stones, patterns etched in ways that suggested devotion rather than decoration, yet these features have long since disappeared beneath shifting sands. Even though no contemporary evidence remains, these narratives converge on similar details. A modest stone structure, the scent of incense, and the feeling of passage through a space that seemed to hover between the tangible and the spiritual. Teams attempting to locate the shrine faced not only vast distances but dunes that shifted unpredictably, erasing paths and footprints within hours. Early explorers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries recorded only vague directions, often relying on oral instructions from nomadic guides whose own memories were imperfect. Modern archaeological surveys employing grid searches and systematic documentation returned no definitive evidence of the shrine. Even areas once reported to contain remnants of stone walls or earthen foundations now show only uniform stretches of sand and occasional isolated rocks, further confounding attempts to reconcile historical accounts with present conditions. The relentless heat and drifting sands consume even stone fragments, leaving behind only echoes of structures once revered and inhabited. In the Gobi Desert, wind patterns can shift entire dunes in a single season, burying or revealing features with apparent randomness. Arid conditions prevent the preservation of wood or organic materials, and even fired clay can fracture and erode over decades when exposed to thermal expansion and sand abrasion. As a result, any physical remains of Shinijinst would have been extraordinarily vulnerable, and the likelihood of finding substantial evidence after a century or more is exceedingly low, even if the shrine had been built from more durable materials than simple stone. Travellers' diaries and sketches hint at precise locations, yet those maps and pages have disappeared or offer only vague coordinates that confound modern searches. Early explorers often described Shinijinst in relation to now unrecognisable landmarks, rocks, dunes, or ephemeral waterholes that no longer exist in the same form. In some cases, the descriptions are inconsistent, reflecting variations in oral transmission or the challenges of navigating the ever-changing desert terrain. These documents, when they survive, provide tantalizing fragments rather than complete guidance, offering clues that might lead to discovery, yet consistently falling short of confirming the shrine's position. Artifacts recovered from nearby settlements hint at the shrine's influence, even if the structure itself has vanished entirely. Archaeologists have documented small ritual objects, ceramic fragments, carved amulets, and metal charms found in the vicinity of what historical accounts suggest may have been Shinijinst's surrounding area. While none of these items can be definitively linked to the shrine, their concentration and stylistic similarities to known Mongolian desert sanctuaries suggest that pilgrims or locals once maintained a network of devotional practices in this region. These artifacts indicate not only the spiritual importance of Shinejinst, but also the possibility that its reach extended beyond a single structure, influencing local customs and offering subtle traces of human devotion, now scattered and obscured by shifting sands. Satellite surveys and aerial reconnaissance reveal fleeting shadows and irregularities in the terrain, but nothing that can be definitively tied to the shrine. Remote sensing technologies can detect subtle variations in sand density or the presence of buried rock alignments, yet these signals are often indistinguishable from natural formations created by wind and erosion. Teams analysing topographical data have noted patterns resembling low walls or terraces, yet follow-up expeditions found nothing to corroborate historical accounts. Even in the modern era, Shinejinst defies detection, illustrating how the desert itself can obscure human constructions to the point of complete disappearance. Sparse tufts of vegetation cling to the dunes where Shinejinst might have stood, bending under gusts that sweep endlessly across a landscape indifferent to human memory. Occasional shrubs and grasses hint at subtle variations in soil and moisture, perhaps marking areas where the shrine once drew water or shade. Wildlife navigates the terrain without regard for historical significance, leaving tracks that appear and vanish within hours, erasing evidence of human passage. The desert's rhythm continues, unaffected by centuries of devotion, and each gust of wind reminds observers that permanence is fleeting in this environment, whether for sand, stone, or human memory. Stories persist in hushed tones around evening fires, retelling the shrine's rituals and the devotion it inspired, as if belief alone could preserve its presence. Even when physical traces vanish, Shinejinst remains a focal point of cultural memory, a symbol of spiritual continuity and resilience in a harsh landscape. Travellers recount pilgrimages that may never have coincided with the shrine's actual location, yet their experiences echo the significance attributed to the site. These narratives, passed from generation to generation, form an intangible map of reverence that persists despite the absence of stone or foundation, preserving the shrine in ways that no desert sands can erase. Generations of guides and explorers have tried to reconcile oral history with observable evidence, yet the shrine continues to elude every methodical search. Attempts to triangulate its location from surviving records, interviews, and environmental features have produced only partial results. Low rises that resemble foundations, depressions in dunes that appear artificial, or minor rock clusters easily mistaken for natural formations. Every discovery raises hope, only for subsequent surveys to confirm that the desert's constant reshaping has erased any trace. The shrine exists both everywhere and nowhere, a paradox that underscores the desert's ability to outlast and obscure human effort. Shinejinst has vanished from the sands, yet the desert continues to murmur its secrets to anyone who listens closely enough. The inexplicable desert glass scatterings. Scattered across the Gobi, shards of glass catch the sun in a way that seems almost deliberate, as though the desert itself has left a warning or a message. These shards are not confined to a single location. In some areas, they form extensive patches spanning hundreds of meters, their glimmering surfaces sharply contrasting with the surrounding sand. Travellers first documented them centuries ago, and modern expeditions have confirmed their presence, yet the origins of this silica-rich material remain unknown. Unlike volcanic lava or obvious meteoritic debris, the desert glass shows no consistent connection to heat sources or impact craters, leaving scientists puzzled by its sudden appearance across remote flats and ridges. Upon closer inspection, the fragments reveal smooth surfaces, occasional bubbles, and jagged edges, each piece reflecting light with an intensity that belies its fragile appearance. Some shards are nearly transparent, while others carry amber or pale green hues, evidence of subtle variations in composition. The edges of many pieces have been weathered by sand and wind, yet even fractured shards retain a sharpness that speaks to the extreme temperatures required to create them. Small clusters of the glass appear almost like frozen waves, as though molten silica once flowed across the desert before cooling abruptly, leaving a glittering scar that persists long after the initial force has vanished. Some shards also bear subtle etchings and striations, patterns formed not by human hands but by the intense thermal forces that shaped them. These striations run in multiple directions, suggesting rapid cooling under variable conditions. In certain locations, shards appear almost sculpted, as if molten silica had been pushed and pulled by unseen currents before solidifying. Tiny air pockets trapped within the glass resemble frozen bubbles, capturing moments of extreme energy that occurred long ago. Field researchers note that these textures are not uniform, with some areas showing near-perfect transparency, while others are clouded with minute mineral inclusions, further baffling attempts to correlate their formation with any known geological process. Laboratory analyses show that these glasses are composed almost entirely of silica, with traces of minerals rarely found in volcanic or meteoritic formations, deepening the mystery of their creation. Studies indicate that temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius would be necessary to melt sand into such glass, far hotter than typical surface fires or standard geological processes in the region. Yet, no evidence of nearby volcanoes or impact structures exists to account for such concentrated heat, leaving the origin of the Gobi glass unresolved. The chemical uniformity across widely separated patches adds another layer of perplexity, suggesting that the phenomenon occurred under conditions both extreme and widespread. Theorists suggest lightning strikes, ancient volcanic activity, or meteor impacts as possible explanations, yet none align fully with the evidence scattered across the desert floor. Lightning can produce small fulgurite tubes, but these rarely cover large expanses and do not account for the depth or distribution observed in the Gobi fields. Volcanic activity is absent in the areas where the shards appear, and meteoritic impacts usually leave discernible craters, none of which have been conclusively identified in association with the glass. Each hypothesis leaves gaps, reinforcing the notion that the glass scatterings may result from forces either unusually rare or currently unknown to science. Expeditions documenting the glass fields note variations in thickness, unusual concentrations of shards, and occasional embedded rocks that resist easy classification, leaving even experienced geologists perplexed. Some areas contain shards only a few millimeters thick, while others form layers several centimeters deep, with fragments sometimes fused together in irregular clusters. Embedded stones and sediment occasionally show evidence of exposure to high heat, yet nearby sand remains unaltered, creating an inconsistency that challenges conventional understanding. Field researchers describe the process of walking across the glass as disorienting. The terrain sparkles like scattered stars, yet no trace of the formation's genesis is apparent. Rather than appearing randomly, the shards often cluster in irregular, seemingly deliberate formations, some tracing shallow depressions or low ridges that defy known environmental patterns. Certain glass fields align with small topographical highs, while others follow contours with no clear hydrological or wind-driven explanation. Satellite imaging confirms that these patterns extend beyond what is visible at ground level, forming a complex mosaic across the desert's surface. Attempts to map the formation systematically reveal no consistency with prevailing winds, ancient riverbeds, or known mineral deposits, leaving the question of placement as enigmatic as the glass itself. Dating techniques suggest that some shards may have formed thousands of years ago, yet variations in weathering and surface abrasion make precise chronology difficult to establish. Radiometric analysis of select fragments indicates formation periods ranging from several thousand to perhaps tens of thousands of years, though desert conditions and repeated wind erosion complicate interpretation. These temporal estimates raise additional questions. If the glass formed long ago, what ancient event could have generated such intense heat across the desert? And if younger shards exist alongside older ones, does this suggest multiple unexplained phenomena occurring over millennia? Each answer seems to spawn further uncertainty. Wind and sand continue to reshape the glass fields, partially burying older shards while exposing new surfaces, creating a constantly shifting tableau that confounds observation. Sandstorms sweep across the flats, transporting fine particles that obscure some shards while polishing others to a luminous sheen. Small dunes form atop older deposits, only to be flattened by subsequent winds, revealing layers of glass that may have lain hidden for decades. The interplay between preservation and erosion ensures that the glass fields are in constant flux, a temporal landscape where the past is visible yet elusive, always hinting at a force beyond comprehension. Wayfarers across the plains have long remarked on the glittering patches, noting their eerie appearance without ever offering an explanation for how they came to exist. Some describe the shards as haunting reminders of ancient events, while others recount stories of heat so intense it could have melted stone itself. Written observations in explorer journals and modern field notes consistently emphasize the dissonance between the shard's presence and the lack of identifiable source. These accounts do not solve the mystery, but they reinforce the phenomenon's persistence in human consciousness, as observers are compelled to confront a material trace that refuses explanation. Pieces of pottery gleam silently under a desert sky that has witnessed countless millennia, yet their origin remains a secret even the harshest sun cannot reveal. The footprints trapped in solid sandstone. Shallow depressions in solid sandstone reveal what appear to be human footprints, frozen in rock as if the desert had preserved a fleeting moment for eternity. These impressions, scattered across southern Gobi formations, are neither subtle nor easily dismissed, their contours etched sharply into stone layers that date back millions of years. Researchers refer to them as the Gobi footprints, though no conclusive identification has been made regarding their origin. What strikes observers is not merely their shape, but the paradox of their preservation. Impressions that should have long since eroded remain intact, prompting questions about the forces that allowed such fleeting human-like traces to endure through deep time. Each impression displays remarkable detail, from heel contour to toe spacing, hinting at weight distribution and motion across soft sediment long since turned to stone. In some cases, faint ridges suggest the imprint of individual toes, while in others the arches of feet are discernible, implying a careful, deliberate placement of weight. The depth of the impressions varies, yet in every instance the clarity is striking, as though the sandstone froze in an instant that captured not just shape but motion. Scientists have noted that even minor inconsistencies in stride length or foot angle are preserved, creating a vivid record of movement that seems almost impossible to reconcile with ordinary sedimentary processes. The sandstone layers enclosing these prints date back millions of years, a context that challenges every assumption about the timing of human presence in the region. Geological studies place the surrounding strata in the late Cretaceous to early Paleogene periods, long before Homo sapiens emerged. This temporal discrepancy has generated both intrigue and skepticism among paleontologists and geologists. As no contemporary human or primate species could have made the tracks, the sedimentary environment, fine silts compacted into hard sandstone, should have obliterated any footprints within decades, yet here they remain, a frozen record whose age and clarity defy standard explanations. Geologists have proposed rapid lithification and mudflow entrapment as possible explanations, yet these models struggle to account for the impression's precision and clarity. Sudden deposition events, such as flooding or volcanic ash layers, can preserve tracks in other contexts. But in the Gobi, no corresponding evidence of rapid sediment accumulation exists in the locations of the footprints. The fine-grained sandstone that houses the impressions suggests slow, uniform sedimentation, making their survival all the more enigmatic. Even experimental replication under controlled conditions fails to fully reproduce the combination of depth, shape, and definition observed in the field, leaving the footprints a singular mystery. Expeditions documenting the tracks employ photogrammetry and 3D scanning, yet the results only deepen the enigma as the prints resist conventional classification. Teams meticulously map each impression, recording angles, lengths, and spacing between successive tracks. The data reveal a pattern that is simultaneously suggestive of human gait and inconsistent with known hominin biomechanics. Isolated footprints appear with no preceding or following track, while others form a series of parallel impressions. Researchers struggle to explain the irregularity, as even partial series reflect an improbable combination of stride length and foot morphology, defying typical anthropological or paleontological comparisons. Stride patterns and alignment defy the norms observed in modern humans or animals, with some tracks appearing in isolation, while others form clusters that resist clear interpretation. Certain impressions follow a straight line, while adjacent clusters curve unpredictably across the sandstone surface. No obvious correlation exists with slope, prevailing wind, or sediment composition, and there is no evidence of water erosion or other natural forces shaping the alignment. The anomalous organization of the footprints intensifies the mystery, as it hints at deliberate placement or forces beyond current scientific understanding. Microscopic analysis of some impressions has revealed fossilized pollen and plant material embedded within the sandstone matrix, offering subtle clues about the environment in which the footprints formed. These microscopic traces indicate that the sediment once supported sparse vegetation, likely small shrubs or grasses, suggesting a temporarily moist or semi-arid environment at the time of deposition. The presence of organic matter within the rock provides rare context for the footprints, helping researchers reconstruct the conditions that allowed such precise impressions to survive lithification. Even so, the embedded pollen does not clarify the identity of the track maker, but it does underscore the extraordinary circumstances required for preservation, a delicate balance between soft sediment, rapid coverage, and slow mineralization that few natural processes achieve. Comparisons with known fossilized footprints highlight both similarities and profound differences, leaving researchers with more questions than answers. Dinosaur tracks in similar strata display distinct claw marks and stride patterns, yet the Gobi impressions lack these features and are proportioned like a human foot. Attempts to liken them to early primates or extinct hominins fail due to the geological age of the sandstone and the anatomical detail of the toes and heels. In both form and scale, these footprints occupy a liminal space between the expected and the inexplicable, challenging conventional interpretation while resisting dismissal. Wind and rain continue to shape the sandstone, revealing some impressions while eroding others, as the desert itself guards its secrets with quiet persistence. Thin layers of sediment periodically accumulate over portions of the prints, obscuring edges and creating the illusion that tracks appear and disappear with the seasons. Occasional flash floods or sandstorms expose hidden impressions, yet the overall pattern remains incomplete and fragmentary. This dynamic interplay of preservation and erosion adds a temporal dimension to the mystery. Each observation captures a moment in an ongoing geological dialogue between rock, weather, and time. Local guides and explorers occasionally report stone surfaces marked by strange depressions, noting their resemblance to human footprints without claiming an explanation. These oral observations, passed down through generations, reinforce the enigma, suggesting that the footprints have been noticed long before scientific inquiry arrived. While anecdotal, such accounts corroborate the persistence of the tracks in public consciousness and hint at a deep, unexplained interaction between humans or human-like forms and the desert environment. They serve as a subtle reminder that mystery often precedes understanding, leaving even seasoned researchers to question the limits of observation. Subtle anomalies further complicate the puzzle. Occasional impressions appear partially overlain by smaller depressions, suggesting repeated contact with soft sediment before lithification. Tiny ripple marks within some tracks indicate movement in a viscous medium, perhaps mud or fine silt, yet these features are inconsistent across the field. In addition, microscopic examination of the surrounding sandstone reveals rare mineral inclusions and faint striations, implying forces of pressure and heat that do not match typical track preservation. Each of these details adds another layer to the enigma, reinforcing the impression that the footprints capture an event that no modern scenario can fully replicate. The footprints endure in silent stone, a puzzle of human-like form frozen in time that no explanation has yet unraveled. The fortress remains at Tevshin Govi. Rising from the sands of Tevshin Govi are the fragmented remains of a fortress, built from stone that does not exist in the surrounding desert. Known to scholars as the Tevshin Govi stronghold, the structure's origin and purpose remain unknown, as no written records or local traditions offer clues. Its isolated location and imported materials suggest an extraordinary effort, yet how such a project was undertaken in one of the harshest regions of the Gobi has never been explained. The walls stand at uneven heights, partially collapsed in some areas, while other sections retain an almost pristine alignment that hints at careful planning and construction. The walls themselves stretch for tens of meters, their partially collapsed form casting long shadows across shifting dunes. Doorways and archways, though eroded, are still visible, their stone frames bearing traces of craftsmanship uncommon in nearby settlements. Interior spaces, now filled with sand and debris, suggest multiple chambers of varying size, yet the purpose of these rooms remains opaque. Some appear to have been defensive in nature, while others could have served as storage or living quarters, but the absence of artifacts leaves every interpretation speculative. The desert winds whistle through gaps in the masonry, carrying grains of sand that slowly reclaim the structure, a quiet reminder of the fortress's vulnerability to time. Geological studies reveal that the stones were quarried hundreds of kilometers away, a journey whose logistics remain unexplained. Mineralogical analysis confirms that many blocks are composed of granite or limestone not found locally, requiring considerable effort to transport over vast stretches of arid terrain. No evidence of ancient roads or hauling systems has been discovered in proximity, further deepening the enigma. The sheer scale of the project suggests a level of organisation and resource mobilisation inconsistent with other known desert structures, raising questions about who could have undertaken such a feat and for what purpose. Close examination shows carefully cut blocks, joined with techniques that suggest knowledge of precise alignment and structural stability. Some stones are fitted with near-perfect seams, leaving only narrow gaps where mortar might have been applied. Certain corners reveal interlocking arrangements that indicate advanced understanding of weight distribution, a technique not commonly observed in regional desert architecture. Despite the apparent sophistication, there are also irregularities, misaligned stones, walls that thin inexplicably in some areas, hinting either at incomplete construction or repairs executed over an indeterminate period. Every detail seems to oscillate between mastery and mystery. Following repeated exploration, no inscriptions, records, or cultural markers identify the builders or their purpose. Archaeologists and historians alike have scoured the surrounding region, searching for ceramics, tools, or written accounts that might illuminate the fortress's history. Nothing conclusive has been found. Early mapping expeditions noted the fortress's anomalous nature, but without corroborating evidence, the structure remains a silent testament to a people or civilization whose identity has been lost. Even satellite imagery, capable of revealing previously hidden features, adds little clarity beyond confirming the fortress's isolation and irregular layout. Sandstorms have carved the walls and filled interior chambers, creating an interplay of exposure and concealment that changes with each passing season. Fine dust coats the stones, highlighting carved edges and revealing faint traces of erosion patterns. During periods of high wind, partially buried passages re-emerge, while other sections vanish beneath fresh dunes. Observers note that the shifting sands give the impression of the fortress breathing with the desert, revealing different aspects of its design depending on the season or vantage point. This constant transformation reinforces the fortress's enigmatic presence, as though the desert itself is both custodian and concealer of its secrets. Signs of gradual erosion on certain walls suggest that parts of the fortress may have been deliberately oriented to interact with seasonal sunlight and wind. Researchers have noted that some wall faces receive prolonged exposure to the rising sun in the spring and the early summer, while others align with prevailing wind channels that funnel gusts through narrow corridors. Such orientation could indicate strategic planning for illumination, ventilation, or defensive purposes, yet the logic remains unclear given the fortress's remote location. Additionally, the surfaces of these walls bear faint tool marks consistent with shaping or smoothing, implying careful workmanship rather than purely functional construction. These details hint at intentions beyond simple habitation or fortification, suggesting a purpose both practical and symbolic that remains undeciphered. Unusual internal chambers, irregular corridors, and seemingly arbitrary orientations suggest design choices that confound comparison with known fortresses of the region. Certain rooms face directions that offer no strategic advantage, while others seem oriented toward distant landmarks with no discernible significance. Small niches and recessed areas, whose function is unclear, dot the interior walls, prompting speculation about storage, ritual, or observational use. The irregularity of the fortress's layout contrasts sharply with the uniformity of stone cutting, a paradox that continues to intrigue researchers who attempt to reconcile form with purpose. Archaeologists mapping the ruins encounter incomplete walls, scattered stones, and features whose purpose remains ambiguous, with every investigation raising more questions than answers. Attempts to trace the original perimeter of the fortress reveal partial enclosures and overlapping layers of construction, suggesting either phased building or long-term modifications. excavation in certain areas exposes compacted earth and fragments of stone that might hint at domestic activity, yet the absence of tools or organic remains leaves such interpretations tentative. Each survey emphasises the fortress's uniqueness, underscoring that it does not conform to any known pattern of desert fortification or settlement. Travellers and local guides occasionally remark on the fortress's isolation, noting the remarkable distance from any known settlement or trade route. Tales recorded in explorer journals describe the ruins appearing unexpectedly over dune crests, their stone walls gleaming in sunlight as though planted deliberately to surprise the observer. While these accounts provide no factual clarification, they reflect a long-standing recognition of the fortress's mysterious presence, reinforcing the sense that the structure has captivated attention for centuries. Even modern expeditions find that approaching the site is an exercise in both navigation and patience, as the shifting sands conceal and reveal paths unpredictably. Microscopic examination of some remaining mortar and stone surfaces reveals traces of rare mineral inclusions, suggesting the builders sourced materials with a keen eye for durability or aesthetics. These inclusions provide subtle evidence of intent, hinting that the fortress was not constructed haphazardly but with careful planning and perhaps knowledge of material properties unknown in contemporary desert architecture. In combination with the imported stone, advanced cutting techniques, and the fortress's strategic yet puzzling layout, these details form a mosaic of sophistication that stands in stark contrast to its isolated, barren surroundings. The fortress walls rise and crumble with the shifting desert, a silent monument to a civilization or purpose that vanished without trace, leaving only questions in the wind. The missing expeditions of the early surveyors. In the late 19th century, teams of surveyors ventured into the central Gobi, tasked with mapping its shifting dunes, salt flats, and remote oases. 2 of these expeditions vanished without trace, leaving behind only fragments of diaries, incomplete maps, and scattered equipment. Known among historians as the Lost Surveyors, their disappearance has been a persistent enigma, a reminder of the desert's capacity to swallow not only travellers, but also their records and stories. Accounts suggest that the teams set out with meticulous planning, yet the vastness and isolation of the terrain quickly overwhelmed even the most seasoned explorers. The desert offered little guidance, each ridge and depression a challenge to orientation and survival. Sandstorms could obliterate tracks within hours, and the uniformity of the terrain created disorienting vistas where distance and direction became almost meaningless. Water sources were rare and ephemeral, forcing surveyors to rely on intermittent oases or shallow wells that often proved inadequate. The extreme temperature fluctuations between day and night tested both endurance and equipment, with tents, maps, and instruments vulnerable to wind, heat, and abrasive sand. Even minor miscalculations could have catastrophic consequences in a landscape where human presence was tenuous at best. Diaries recovered from abandoned campsites reveal meticulous observations interrupted by sudden notes of anxiety and confusion. Entries describe terrain features in precise detail, the locations of dunes, rock formations, and salt flats recorded with painstaking care. Yet the entries abruptly shift tone, documenting unanticipated obstacles, sudden fatigue, and the mounting frustration of losing compass bearings. Some fragments contain mentions of unfamiliar tracks or shadows crossing the dunes, hints that the explorers may have encountered elements they could not explain or anticipated. Though these passages are incomplete and frustratingly vague, surveyors recorded the scarcity of water and the prevalence of mirages, phenomena that complicated both navigation and morale. Recurrent optical illusions could make distant hills appear nearer or exaggerate the size of ephemeral pools, creating confusion in an environment where orientation was already tenuous. These conditions were compounded by the limitations of 19th century surveying tools. Sextants, compasses, and rudimentary chronometers provided only approximate guidance. Diary fragments indicate moments of growing desperation, noting repeated backtracking and the exhaustion of both people and pack animals. With dunes constantly shifting, previous tracks were concealed, leaving explorers uncertain whether they were retracing paths or wandering into unknown terrain. Some entries detail encounters with windswept depressions, where footprints disappeared entirely, replaced by fine dust. Pack animals, essential for carrying supplies, struggled to navigate loose sand and rocky outcrops, occasionally collapsing or straying from the path. Surveyors attempted to mark their course with cairns or temporary flags, yet subsequent entries report that even these markers had been buried or blown away. The desert itself seemed to erase any evidence of progress, leaving the teams increasingly isolated and disoriented. Remnants of equipment found scattered years later hint at the grueling conditions the surveyors endured. Metal compasses, rusted chronometers, and remnants of leather water pouches were found partially buried, often in small clusters that suggest hurried abandonment. Pack saddles and canvas tents lay torn by wind and sun, as though left in moments of urgency. These artifacts, combined with skeletal remains of pack animals observed in isolated dunes, underscore the immense physical toll exacted by the desert. Even when carrying only essential supplies, the teams would have faced exhaustion, dehydration, and exposure, highlighting the human fragility against the desert's relentless scale. Every recovered fragment adds a silent testament to their struggle, preserving hints of lives interrupted mid-journey. Attempts to retrace the missing expedition's routes uncovered only scattered tools, tattered tents, and footprints that abruptly ended. Later search parties combed valleys, dunes, and salt flats for clues, finding items partially buried in sand or eroded by wind. Fragments of diaries and sketches were occasionally recovered, but no campsite yielded definitive evidence of survival or catastrophe. Even modern expeditions using aerial surveys and satellite imagery have only identified remnants too sparse to reconstruct a clear path. The pattern of disappearance remains as mysterious today as it did more than a century ago. Analysis of surviving fragments suggests a combination of environmental stress, navigational error, and logistical challenges may have overwhelmed the teams. Water shortages, extreme temperatures, and the strain of carrying surveying instruments created conditions in which small miscalculations could escalate into life-threatening situations. Yet, some diary entries hint at other anomalies, mentions of unusual formations, tracks that could not be identified, and strange sounds carried across the desert. Whether these were misinterpretations born of fatigue and stress or actual, unexplained phenomena remains unresolved, leaving the expedition's fate shrouded in speculation. Certain diary entries allude to encounters with local nomadic guides whose accounts remain tantalizingly incomplete. References to fleeting assistance or warnings appear in fragmented notes, indicating the surveyors may have briefly interacted with herders familiar with the desert's hidden water sources. Yet these entries end abruptly or are crossed out, leaving no clear indication of whether the guidance was followed or if misunderstandings arose. The possibility of miscommunication or of failing to locate essential water caches would have compounded the dangers already present. These glimpses of human contact emphasize that the lost expeditions were not completely isolated, yet even brief interactions could not prevent their ultimate disappearance, further deepening the mystery of their fate. Later expeditions incorporated these lessons, yet no subsequent party ever fully located the lost surveyor's path or final campsite. Modern explorers rely on historical maps and fragmented records, attempting to cross-reference terrain features described in the diaries with current geography. Some areas have shifted significantly due to dune movement, while others have become inaccessible or obscured by salt flats. Even with modern GPS and satellite imagery, recreating the exact routes remains a near impossible task. Each attempt underlines the Gobi's relentless capacity to conceal and confound, reinforcing the sense that the lost surveyors were swallowed not just by space, but by the desert's unyielding logic. Fragments of maps and sketches left behind continue to intrigue historians and cartographers, hinting at discoveries that were never completed. These remnants suggest that the surveyors were attempting to chart previously unrecorded terrain, including seasonal lakes, minor mountain passes, and intermittent riverbeds. While portions of the maps align with known features, many areas are marked with symbols or annotations whose meaning cannot be deciphered. Some sketch marks resemble structures or natural formations not currently verifiable, leading to speculation about geological or cultural sites that may have existed in the late 19th century but have since vanished or transformed. Even more mysterious are the repeated references in diary fragments to sudden environmental anomalies. Surveyors occasionally note abrupt changes in terrain, unusual wind patterns, or areas where compasses seemed unreliable. Though these mentions are brief, they hint at localized conditions that may have interfered with navigation or amplified the desert's dangers. Some entries refer to tracks or impressions that did not match any known animal, leaving open the possibility of encountering wildlife or phenomena beyond contemporary understanding. Such observations, though incomplete, add an unsettling layer to the historical record. The lost surveyors remain as shadows etched into the Gobi sands, their maps unfinished and their fates swallowed by the vast, indifferent desert. The Whispering Cliffs of Mandalgovi. Silence dominates the ridges until the wind curves through hidden channels, carrying whispers that defy explanation. The murmurs, faint and ethereal, have been described by nomads and travellers as resembling human speech, soft conversations or distant chants that rise and fall unpredictably. Some accounts note that the whispers appear only in the early morning or late evening, when the desert is at its quietest, and vanish entirely during the heat of the day. Observers report an uncanny sense of recognition, as if the cliffs themselves respond to human presence, yet no source has ever been identified. The phenomenon has persisted across generations, drawing both scientific curiosity and local reverence. Jagged rock faces twist sunlight and shadow in ways that seem to animate the cliffs with unseen motion. Over millennia, wind and water erosion sculpted deep fissures, narrow ledges, and hollowed chambers into the sandstone, producing natural amplifiers and conduits for sound. Seasonal wind patterns funnel gusts into pockets and recesses, creating tonal variations that carry unpredictably across the plain. Some hollows remain completely silent even under the strongest winds, while adjacent chambers resonate with surprising clarity. The cliff's uneven surfaces reflect and scatter sound waves, making ordinary noises travel in ways that would be impossible in open terrain, suggesting a complex interaction between landscape and atmosphere that has yet to be fully documented. Nomads describe soft murmuring voices that appear only when the desert is at its quietest, far from settlements. Herding families recount that the whispers emerge near narrow ledges or deep alcoves, sometimes seeming to follow a traveller as they move along the cliffs. Some describe tones resembling distant laughter or low conversation, yet the source remains invisible. Seasonal accounts also indicate that the whispers can change depending on wind direction, with certain hollows producing clearer tonal patterns than others. Children, according to villagers, often hear the murmurs more distinctly, though elders report that experience and exposure alter perception rather than diminish it. Historical accounts hint at explorers noting faint calls or chants echoing across rock faces, their sources never traced. Early 20th century diaries from scientific expeditions occasionally mention singing walls or voices in stone, along with sketches of cliff formations. Surveyors often attempted to locate the sounds using rudimentary listening techniques, recording the approximate position of hollows and ledges where the murmurs were strongest. Yet these entries consistently conclude with the same frustration. The sounds shifted with the wind, the hollows produced inconsistent echoes, and no living source could be verified. These historical fragments suggest that the whispers are not a recent phenomenon, but have persisted as part of the desert's acoustic landscape. Acoustic measurements have revealed areas of unusual resonance, yet the intensity and clarity of the sounds often exceed expectations. Modern researchers using sensitive microphones, decibel meters, and wind monitoring equipment have mapped hollows capable of amplifying faint noises. These studies show that some cavities can channel sound up to hundreds of meters, particularly when winds pass through them at precise angles. Still, field recordings fail to capture the richness or apparent intentionality reported by human observers. The combination of subtle pressure changes, temperature gradients, and irregular cliff geometry likely contributes to the phenomenon, but no single variable explains the phenomenon fully, leaving the whispers partially unexplained. The mind, strained by isolation and vast open space, seems to accentuate even the slightest vibration in the stone. Psychological research on auditory perception in extreme and quiet environments shows that humans are prone to detecting patterns where none exist, a process amplified by heightened focus and anticipation. In the case of Mandalgovi, prolonged exposure to the desert's monotony may sharpen awareness of ambient sounds, making them appear deliberate. Witnesses frequently report goosebumps, hair standing on end, or a tingling sensation along the spine when hearing the murmurs. Despite this, the The consistent descriptions of tonal quality and spatial direction across unrelated observers suggest a real physical acoustic component combined with perceptual amplification. Certain cliff alcoves appear to funnel sound in unexpected directions, producing tones that mimic human speech patterns. Field studies have shown that some recesses amplify high-frequency vibrations, while others emphasize low, resonant tones. Under particular conditions, even the sound of footsteps or distant conversation can be carried into these hollows, creating the impression of proximity and responsiveness. Researchers experimenting with artificial noise sources noted that the cliffs sometimes produce echoes that defy intuitive expectations, making a sound appear to come from multiple points simultaneously. These anomalies, though partially understood, remain insufficient to fully explain the reports of coherent human-like whispers. Comparative studies show that Mandalgovi's geological layout is unlike other nearby formations, its cavities positioned almost geometrically. While other sandstone cliffs in the Gobi region display echoes and minor resonance, none have produced consistent auditory effects resembling voices. The cliff's irregular ridges, sharp overhangs, and deep hollows create acoustic niches rarely found elsewhere, and the alignment of these features allows subtle wind currents to generate tonal complexity. Even minor shifts in wind direction or speed can alter the auditory landscape, producing entirely different effects. This uniqueness reinforces the idea that Mandalgovi represents a rare convergence of geology, physics, and environment, where nature itself creates sounds that challenge conventional understanding. Visitors frequently recount conversations, laughter, or sighs borne on the wind, yet the source remains invisible and untouchable. Hikers, geologists, and documentary teams have all noted the same effect. The murmurs follow movement, rise and fall unpredictably, and vanish when approached directly. Attempts to triangulate the sounds using multiple observers or recording devices yield conflicting results. Some report hearing multiple voices speaking simultaneously, while others perceive singular tonal shifts. The elusive and mutable nature of the whispers ensures that even the most detailed measurements and observations capture only fragments, leaving the full scope of the phenomenon beyond reach. Modern technological studies offer partial insights, yet they deepen the mystery. Acoustic simulations and computer models suggest that the cliff's cavities can create interference patterns that exaggerate or distort sound, yet these models fail to reproduce the perceived intelligence of the murmurs. Wind channeling, echoes, and resonance explain part of the experience, but the phenomenon's consistency across years and observers suggests that something more remains unexplained. Audio engineers and field scientists continue to return, each encounter reinforcing the cliff's reputation as a site where the desert challenges understanding. The desert keeps its secrets tightly woven into the cliffs, whispers vanishing as abruptly as they emerge, leaving only the sense that something beyond comprehension still lingers. The unexplained fossil alignment of Bugin Sav. At Bugin Sav, hundreds of fossilized bones lie arranged in patterns that defy expectations of random deposition. The site's skeletal remains form rows, clusters, and parallel alignments suggesting sudden, forceful environmental events, yet no known natural mechanism accounts fully for the uniformity. Field surveys repeatedly note that many of the bones are oriented in remarkably consistent directions across multiple sediment layers, raising questions about the processes that could have produced such regularity. Scientists refer to this phenomenon as the unexplained fossil alignment, a testament to prehistoric forces that have left a silent, puzzling record in the southern Gobi Desert. Sedimentary layers reveal a landscape once sculpted by intermittent floods and shifting sands, preserving life in astonishing clarity. Compact strata of sandstone and claystone envelop the bones, creating impressions of precise placement and subtle compression that indicate rapid burial rather than gradual accumulation. Ripple marks, fine laminations, and minor sediment deformations provide evidence of episodic water flow and environmental stress, yet they cannot fully account for the uniform orientation of larger bones. Variations in sediment colour from pale ochre to deep reddish brown suggest cycles of wetting and drying, hinting at a desert environment periodically transformed by sudden, transient waters. The site was first meticulously recorded during mid-20th century expeditions, when paleontologists measured, sketched, and catalogued each specimen. Diaries from these field teams describe astonishment at the apparent regularity of alignments, with bones appearing almost intentionally positioned. Early sketches depict rows of vertebrae, limb bones, and ribs lying nearly parallel across multiple meters of exposure. Even in shallow excavation layers, the same orientation persisted. Observers noted that the bone's alignment remained consistent over considerable distance, a feature that made Bugyin-Tsav unlike other fossil beds in the Gobi region. Among the fossils are remains of large herbivorous dinosaurs, smaller mammals, and fragmentary skeletal structures, all preserved in remarkable clarity. The herbivorous specimens dominate the site, with limb and rib bones frequently aligned in parallel planes. Smaller mammal bones occasionally fill spaces between larger remains, often oriented in the same direction. Many specimens display microfractures or subtle compression consistent with rapid burial, yet the uniformity of orientation remains unexplained. Even articulated vertebrae maintain the directional consistency, suggesting that the forces affecting deposition acted evenly across both large and small species. Rows, clusters, and parallel orientations suggest a deliberate order that challenges conventional models of fossil deposition. Vertebrae are often positioned end to end, while long limb bones form nearly equidistant lines. Rib fragments and smaller skeletal elements follow the same directional pattern. Across multiple strata, the repetition of these arrangements indicates an ordering process that is statistically improbable for natural scattering. Paleontologists have noted that such regularity is nearly impossible to replicate through conventional fluvial, aeolian, or gravitational processes alone. Hydrological analysis indicates that flash floods or temporary water channels could have moved bones, yet the alignment across multiple layers cannot be fully explained. High-energy water currents normally scatter bones irregularly and break larger elements, but Bugyin-Tsav shows minimal breakage and striking directional consistency. Sediment composition, grain size, and compaction indicate rapid deposition in calm yet forceful events, producing a pattern unlike anything observed in comparable desert fossil sites. The combination of sudden burial and remarkable order has made researchers cautious in attributing the alignment solely to water flow. Subtle microstructural evidence within the sediment further deepens the puzzle. Fine root traces, minor fractures, and mineral deposits appear around some bones, suggesting rapid coverage and minimal post-burial disturbance. Small ripple marks indicate transient water movement, yet larger fossils remain largely unshifted. In several areas, impressions of surrounding sediment match the contours of individual bones, as if they were embedded almost immediately after death. These microclues suggest a complex interplay of environmental forces that created exceptional preservation conditions, yet they stop short of explaining why alignment is so precise. No signs of scavenger disturbance or post-burial displacement appear in the field notes, intensifying the anomaly. Bones show little evidence of gnawing, trampling, or insect activity. Even delicate vertebrae and rib fragments are preserved without disruption. This level of preservation indicates that the site experienced minimal biological interference after deposition. The fossil's relative stability across decades of exposure further confirms the rarity of these conditions and reinforces the sense of a singular, unexplained event shaping the assemblage. Recent imaging techniques have allowed researchers to reconstruct the positions and orientations of each fossil in three-dimensional space. Laser scanning, photogrammetry, and drone-based mapping have revealed subtle inclines, tilts, and micropatterns previously undetectable. Some bones exhibit slight deviations from perfect parallelism, creating a faint gradient across the site. Digital models enable precise measurement of spacing and alignment, confirming that the patterns are not artifacts of measurement or selective excavation. Yet even with these tools, the phenomenon's origin remains elusive, as modern simulations of water, wind, or sediment dynamics fail to reproduce the observed regularity. Notes from early paleontologists provide additional context, reinforcing the modern observations. Diaries record initial theories that the bones were deposited by floods, landslides, or predator activity, followed by expressions of frustration as these ideas proved insufficient. Sketches show careful documentation of rows and clusters, with notations highlighting the apparent order among species and bone types. Comparisons between early field notes and contemporary imaging confirm that the alignments have persisted unaltered, indicating that the pattern is intrinsic to the site rather than a result of later environmental disturbances. Looking at fossil sites throughout Asia and North America, researchers find few parallels, emphasizing Bugyin-Sav's uniqueness. The Nemegt Formation and other Gobi fossil beds contain dense assemblages, yet none display the same level of cross-species alignment or consistent directional orientation. Globally, fossil sites with unusual preservation are often limited to mass mortality events or rapid volcanic burial, but none combine species variety, intact skeletal elements, and such precise alignment. This makes Bugyin-Sav a rare and compelling record of past environmental processes, one that challenges existing taphonomic and geological models. Modern research continues to explore the site, combining paleontology, sedimentology, and geophysics in hopes of understanding the alignment. Efforts include repeated surveys, acoustic testing, and experimental simulations of flash floods and sediment movement. Despite these attempts, the precise mechanism behind the fossil orientations remains unresolved. Every new study reaffirms that Bugyin-Sav's alignments are not easily explained, and the fossils themselves continue to offer a silent testament to forces that acted with both suddenness and precision. The fossils lie perfectly aligned in silence, their arrangement a frozen message of forces long vanished, yet no explanation has ever emerged to account for the secret they preserve. The skeletons at Udenkad. The silent human forms at Udenkad convey a story written in bone, their orientations puzzling researchers who have studied them for decades. Nestled in narrow alcoves along weathered cliffs, the skeletal remains reveal a combination of deliberate placement and extraordinary preservation. Some skeletons lie fully articulated, with limbs carefully positioned, while others are slightly scattered yet still oriented in consistent patterns that defy random deposition. Early observers noted the uncanny regularity, with skulls and long bones often aligned along subtle lines, traced across multiple alcoves. The assemblage immediately suggested that something beyond ordinary burial practices or natural processes had contributed to the site's enduring mystery. The alcoves themselves, carved over centuries by wind, rain, and subtle shifts in sediment, create micro-environments that have helped preserve the bones. Layers of fine sand, occasionally interspersed with gravel and mineral deposits, act as both cushion and seal, limiting exposure to scavengers and erosion. Temperature fluctuations are buffered within the narrow recesses, and the cliff's particular mineral composition, rich in calcium and iron, has left faint coatings on some bones that have slowed decay. Even the slightest rain or occasional runoff appears to have been redirected harmlessly around the skeletons, preserving delicate skeletal features such as finger bones, vertebral processes, and cranial sutures. This combination of shelter, climate, and mineralization is rare in the Gobi Desert, and it has allowed these remains to survive with remarkable clarity for centuries. Archaeologists first documented the site during early 20th century surveys, meticulously recording sketches, measurements, and field notes that continue to guide research today. Initial teams were struck by the repetition of skeletal placement patterns across multiple alcoves, noting parallel rows and radiating arrangements that followed the contours of the cliff walls. Field diaries describe careful measurements of spacing, limb orientation, and skull alignment, with early photographs revealing the preservation of even the smallest skeletal elements. Later surveys confirmed these observations, and the repeated documentation over decades strengthened the sense that the arrangements were deliberate rather than incidental. The assemblage includes a wide range of ages, from fully grown adults to adolescents and juveniles, each preserved with striking integrity. Analysis of teeth shows varying degrees of wear, revealing dietary patterns and hints of developmental age, while subtle joint and vertebral features provide insight into physical activity and health. In some cases, minor fractures and healed injuries are clearly visible, offering glimpses into the individual's lives. Despite this diversity, the skeletons share consistent orientation patterns, suggesting a unifying factor in their deposition that has yet to be fully explained. Detailed mapping of the site reveals alignment patterns that defy expectations. Some clusters are oriented along imaginary lines that appear to converge on specific alcoves or natural formations within the cliffs. Limbs frequently mirror one another across adjacent skeletons, and skulls face angles that recur with near universal consistency. Measurements indicate regular spacing between bones that seems too precise to be accidental. Across multiple alcoves, the alignment remains remarkably consistent, hinting at a system of placement or influence beyond casual deposition. Preservation is further enhanced by subtle mineralization and sediment interaction. Bones are often partially coated with calcium and iron compounds, producing a thin protective crust while highlighting fine surface details. In certain alcoves, sediment impressions around the bones suggest that rapid coverage may have occurred shortly after deposition, preventing disturbance. Evidence of desiccation has hardened some elements without fracturing them, preserving even fragile finger and toe bones. Such preservation provides a rare opportunity to study the skeletal material in a near-original state, yet it also deepens the mystery of how such intact remains could survive for so long in a desert environment. Anthropological studies underscore the uniqueness of the site. Comparisons with regional burial practices reveal no precedent for placing remains in cliff alcoves with such orientation or spacing. Traditional methods in the Gobi Desert include shallow graves, cremation, or open-air exposure, none of which correspond to the conditions at Udenkad. The absence of artifacts, tools, or ceremonial objects leaves the skeletal arrangements as the sole evidence of human presence. Their very placement seems to serve as both record and enigma, leaving researchers to puzzle over the motivations or forces that produce such carefully aligned remains. Modern excavation techniques have expanded our understanding without resolving the mystery. Laser scanning and photogrammetry allow precise measurements of bone orientation, while 3D reconstructions create models that capture subtle curvature and spacing patterns. Geochemical analysis has detected microtraces of mineral deposition and water seepage, adding insight into how environmental factors contributed to preservation. Even with this technology, simulations of natural processes fail to replicate the observed arrangement, reinforcing the sense that these skeletons occupy a space between natural phenomena and human intention. Some alignments suggest directional movement or repeated visitation, yet the evidence remains inconclusive. Certain clusters appear to have been placed along slight inclines within alcoves, while others hint that remains were carried from nearby locations in a sequence rather than deposited all at once. Subtle variations in position may indicate intentional spacing, but without artifacts or additional context, definitive interpretation is impossible. The consistency of placement across different alcoves hints at a system or practice now lost to history, preserved only in the enduring silence of stone and bone. Local oral histories, though fragmentary, reinforce the site's enigmatic reputation. Nomadic elders recount cliffs where bones seem to shift with the sands, or where human remains were long visible before formal documentation. These accounts offer perspective on the long-standing recognition of Udenkad, though they provide no explanatory framework. Repeatedly, survey teams have noted that locals treated the site with caution or reverence, suggesting that its unusual features were acknowledged across generations, even if their origin remained unknown. The broader significance of Udenkad lies in its intersection of human presence, environmental preservation, and unresolved patterns. The site challenges our understanding of survival strategies, cultural practices, and skeletal preservation in extreme landscapes. Few locations anywhere in the world provide such a combination of intact human remains, systematic placement, and preservation conditions that endure across centuries. For archaeologists, the site is simultaneously a laboratory, a puzzle, and a warning of the limits of interpretation when evidence exists, but context remains elusive. Resting in their silent alcoves, the skeleton's placement is a riddle etched into stone, hinting at a story that the desert refuses to tell.